Is Putin trapped? The war in Ukraine has now lasted for over 1,000 days. That's 1,000 days of both Russia and Ukraine continuing to accumulate losses, both countries trying to use every available tool at their disposal to turn the tide of the war. For Ukraine, this meant receiving more than $230 billion in aid, either financial or military, from NATO and its allies across the globe, and the Ukrainian military has used this aid to great effect, even managing to counter-invade Russia, the implications of which we'll discuss shortly. For Russia, though, the war has been nothing short of a disaster from day one. It started with a failed operation to sever the Ukrainian government at its core in Kyiv. That led to the lackluster mobilization and logistics strategies that ultimately caused the initial invasion of Kyiv to be repelled by the Ukrainian forces. Then the Russian Navy was forced to abandon its posts alongside the Ukrainian coast, a remarkable achievement for Ukraine considering that they have no real navy to speak of, which leads us to the first half of 2024, which saw negligible gains for the Russian military on the current main front line in Donbass. But what exactly led to this sudden decline? And is this an indicator that the war might be coming to an end, with Putin finally admitting defeat? The truth of Russia's current situation is nuanced and depends on multiple factors, so let's delve a bit deeper into what exactly led to Russia's military failure in Ukraine and the possible ramifications of the war extending into 2025. It wouldn't be wrong to say the first half of 2024 was considered the preparation phase for both countries. The Russian military enacted some of its plans in late spring and early summer in the aptly named Summer Campaign of 2024. The campaign involved mounting a renewed invasion effort on the Kharkiv region, which was previously freed from Russian occupation back in November 2022. By now, it should be obvious how the summer invasion turned out for the Russians. It was a colossal failure. The Russian military used odd tactics in the region, to say the least. Instead of leveraging the army's large consignment of military vehicles, specifically tanks, the Russians predominantly focused on infantry-based strategies. Reports from the Kharkiv region at the time suggested that the Russian army used regular soldiers who would ride motorcycles to get to the newly made front lines as quickly as possible before discarding their bikes to join their fellow soldiers in the trenches. To support this initiative, Russia deployed makeshift turtle tanks, actually T-62s, T-72s, and T-80s, modified with additional metal armor on top. Those modifications highlighted Russia's growing desperation on the Kharkiv front, as even its older tanks required makeshift upgrades to remain viable in combat. The turtle tanks had practically no offensive capabilities, which indicated that Russia was starting to run out of usable tanks and modern armor to use on the Kharkiv front. Why is that? Well, the answer perhaps lies in how Russian tanks proved to be much more vulnerable than they were supposed to be. On paper, T-90s should be modern tanks with combat capabilities close to the American M1 Abrams, the British Challenger 2, or the German Leopard 2. All of these tanks have similar main armaments, electronic warfare defenses, and optics for low vision and nighttime operations. In fact, the T-90 was lauded to have some of the most potent armor casing of modern tanks. However, the T-90, like its older cousins, the T-70s and 80s, was equipped with an autoloader for the main armament, unlike its Western counterparts. This feature allowed the tank to operate with one fewer crew member, but came with a critical design flaw. The spare ammunition was stored both below the main turret in the autoloader and dispersed throughout the hull, a layout that was necessary due to the smaller size of Russian tanks. This configuration created a devastating vulnerability. If explosive ordnance penetrates the tank and ignites the stored ammunition, whether in the autoloader or elsewhere in the hull, it can trigger a chain reaction of detonating shells. This jack-in-the-box effect results in the catastrophic destruction of the tank, often launching the turret sky high. In traditional vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infantry combat, this wasn't particularly noteworthy, as the casing was a relatively small target that could only be hit slightly above or below the vehicle, which were unusual trajectories for ground combat. However, the Ukrainian army used weapons and tactics that capitalized on that weakness. By using small, commercial-grade drones and outfitting them with grenades or anti-tank mines, the Ukrainian drone operators could directly guide the drone above the tank, specifically targeting either the hatch or the ammo storage. The result, the absolute annihilation of Russian tanks, in which practically no measures were enough to protect against the incoming drones. The proliferation of drone-based warfare stretched far beyond using them against tanks. The drones were outfitted with either surveillance capabilities or explosive ordnance, making them vital to practically any scenario and used on both sides of the conflict. The main benefit of using drones, at least for Ukraine, is that it allows its army to shore up its two major weaknesses. The first was lack of personnel. Ukraine has roughly a third of Russia's population, and its armed forces at the start of the war were outnumbered by as much as 5-1. This ratio got better over time as Ukraine tightened its conscription efforts and volunteers flocked to defend the country. But even today, Ukraine is estimated to have around 70% of Russia's total active manpower and only 60% of reserve forces. Secondly, drone warfare was a great economic equalizer. The FPV drones Ukraine used for small-scale missions cost as little as $400 to $500, making them highly affordable. Meanwhile, surveillance drones like the DJI Mavic cost between $1,500 and $3,000, according to Reuters. Even more robust models such as DJI's agricultural drones only cost a few $1,000s, keeping drone warfare relatively inexpensive compared to traditional military equipment. More robust drones such as the agricultural models from DJI come at a higher price point. For example, the DJI Agras T10 costs nearly $10,000, while other models in the Agras line range into the tens of thousands of dollars. Despite their higher cost, these drones offer significant capabilities, making them valuable assets on the battlefield. When combined with the ordnance and necessary modifications to make the drone flightworthy in a more militarized setup, such as extending its total range, Ukraine could field a single-use anti-tank drone for as little as $15,000. Compare this to the cost of the average tank, which ranges from $2 to $4 million, and you can see why investing in drones can be lucrative. Even if 1 in 10 drones hits a target, which is often the most cited statistic from the Ukrainian military squads that focus on drone warfare, it could be well worth the investment. Drone warfare has also redefined Ukraine's coastal defenses. The initial wave of the Russian invasion included the Black Sea Fleet that blocked Ukraine's coast and prevented ships from venturing into deeper waters. This resulted in Ukraine's marine trade having to be rerouted either by hugging the coastal waters, moving alongside Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, or by transporting the goods over ground to Romania and using its port to send ships through the Bosporus. Regardless of the option, the increased length and logistics caused grain prices to rise globally, as Ukraine is the 7th largest exporter of wheat in the world. The Ukrainians managed an early victory in April 2022 when they located the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, Moskva, and fired at it with coastal anti-ship missiles. But the real kicker came with drones, this time modified for sea-to-sea warfare. Ukraine has taken drone warfare to a new level, using coastal drones like the Sea Baby and Magura V5 to target Russian ships. These surface-based drones carried out nighttime raids that forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat miles away from Ukrainian shores. Most of the fleet has since been relocated to Novorossiysk, leaving Sevastopol largely inoperable due to repeated long-range missile strikes. This has severely limited Russia's naval power in the region. The scale of Ukraine's drone warfare only grew in 2024, leading to significant Russian equipment losses that Moscow struggled to replenish. Reports from Russian state-owned agencies like TASS and IRA Novosti claim that Russia deployed its experimental T-14 Armata tanks, a modern upgrade to the T-90, on the battlefield. However, other sources, including the National Interest, dispute these claims, stating that the T-14s were never deployed due to their high cost and inefficiency compared to the T-90. Even if deployed, the T-14s would likely have faced the same challenges as other Russian equipment. Long-range Ukrainian drone tactics and frequent attacks made deploying expensive assets too risky. Ukraine's ability to produce and launch drones daily has created a consistent and cost-effective threat that Russia has struggled to counter. Russia's losses came to a head in August 2024 when Ukraine did what was previously unthinkable. They occupied Russian territory. The Ukrainian army crossed the border into the Kursk region, catching Russia by complete surprise. The Kursk invasion started small, with reports of between 300 and 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers supported by armored vehicles, tanks, and long-range strikes. But the extent of the invasion would soon grow to allow Ukraine to occupy roughly 500 square miles of territory inside Kursk in 3 weeks, which was more than Russia gained over the previous 7 months. The Kursk invasion highlighted a few problems that Russia seemed to struggle with, which would only accelerate its possible downfall. First, the Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion was counterintuitive, paradoxical, and delayed. Initial reports from Russia suggested that it would mount a counteroffensive in as little as a few days, and yet the counteroffensive didn't come. Russian soldiers rapidly retreated from the region, with the military building defensive trenches to slow the Ukrainian advance. Those same trenches would be used by Ukraine itself when they managed to take over the territory, as they would stall the Russian counteroffensive in turn. The official reports from the Kremlin severely downplayed the actual state of the invasion, suggesting that the damage was significantly lower than first reported. This was obviously an attempt to keep the Russian Russian population sternly under the influence of existing propaganda, which perpetuated the notion that Ukrainians were being used by the West to remove Russian culture. The propaganda went so far as to call the invaders terrorists, which was possibly a way for Putin to justify more persistent conscription efforts throughout the country. Secondly, the Ukrainian soldiers met relatively little resistance in Kursk. Unlike the contract soldiers who were fighting on the front, the bulk of the stationed troops in the Russian regions surrounding Ukraine seemed to be conscripted men on mandatory military service terms. Ukraine managed to capture around 600 men in the 3 weeks of the invasion, and an early report suggested that conscripts comprised 80% of the prisoners of war that were processed. The interviews with the prisoners revealed that some conscripts received as little as a few weeks of training before being shipped to their posts. The significant disparity between the use of conscripts and contract soldiers indicated that Russia was already trying to cut down its costs as much as possible. The Russian budget for 2024 was expected to expend as much as 40% of the government's spending on military and national defense. In other words, the country would use roughly 7% of its GDP on the military, a figure nearly double that of the US and triple most Western countries. The contracts for the soldiers were made much more lucrative, with salaries triple or quadruple the national average, ostensibly to attract as much manpower as it could for the front lines as possible. And yet, while the number of Russian contract soldiers soared through 2023 and 24, the actual number of troops hasn't. According to Riddle, an independent Russian media outlet that compiled the number of newly signed contracts throughout 2023, the figures reported by Russian authorities are significantly more inflated than reality suggests. Of the 490,000 contracts in 2023, Riddle estimates that only 150,000 to 200,000 of those indicate actual new troops that Russia could use. The disparity was chalked up to the significantly shorter contracts that the military started offering in 2022, usually to prisoners or soldiers exiting mandatory military service. With a contract that lasted only 3 to 6 months, a single soldier could renew their contract multiple times, each one being counted separately in the official statistics. The other, much bigger reason as to why Russia's military didn't grow as much as expected is more concerning. The country is losing troops at an alarming rate. The UK military intelligence suggested that Russia suffered as many as 700,000 military casualties by the end of October 2024. These include both deaths and injuries that would preclude future military service. Out of those, around 70,000 deaths were confirmed by the end of September 2024, according to independent Russian outlets Mediazona and Meduza, as well as BBC Russia. However, the report by the BBC suggests that the actual death count is expected to be significantly higher due to a lack of transparency in reporting deaths in the military. Even worse for Putin is the fact that the Russian losses keep accelerating. September 2024 was considered the deadliest month of the war to that point, the 5th consecutive month where the daily casualty rate never dropped below 1,000 troops, but October shattered that record, with casualties spiking to nearly 1,400 per day throughout the month. Ukrainian intelligence suggested that in total, Russia lost over 40,000 soldiers in October alone. And November 2024 seemed to have followed suit, with casualty rates hovering between 1,500 and 1,700 per day. In September 2024, the estimated total casualty count hovered around 640,000, but if the monthly trend continues, Russia could be expected to mark the 1 millionth casualty relatively early in 2025. Simply put, Russia can't sign on more soldiers in time to replenish its ranks. The contract soldiers get less and less time to train before they're deployed to the front lines. This, coupled with Russia having fewer and fewer tanks and vehicles to protect them, is likely the main reason behind the increased casualty rate. The more soldiers die, the more are needed to replace them. The meat grinder in Donbass never stops churning through Russian lives. The invasion of Kursk has led to Putin adopting severe and quite desperate measures to maintain the image of the Russian military being able to outperform Ukraine. The first of these measures came with the frequent nuclear red lines that Russia drew around the war. The country's nuclear defense policy has continued to change in terms of what Russia feels justifies the use of its nuclear weapons to defend its territory. Before the war, the policy was typically directed to other nuclear powers such as the US or China to warn against entering a direct conflict with Russia. After the war started, Putin started calling on the country's nuclear reserves whenever NATO would start suggesting more advanced weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Similar threats delayed deliveries of advanced long-range weaponry, specifically missiles that could be used to target vital Russian infrastructure close to Moscow. When the Kursk invasion happened, one of those red lines was crossed, namely Ukraine being able to enter Russia's territory and start its own occupation attempt. And yet there was no nuclear response from Putin at the time. The Kursk disaster led to NATO adopting a more aggressive stance toward Russia, with NATO military chiefs advocating for Ukraine to be given the opportunity to use long-range missiles to target Russian military compounds and infrastructure. This was one of the few caveats that the US put on the weapons they donated to Ukraine, and it remained there until November. In late November, the administration of outgoing President Joe Biden approved the use of ATACMS long-range missiles, which were transferred to Ukraine in April 2024, inside Russian territory. The exact wording of the approval seems to imply that the weapons will be used in Kursk, at least for now, with Ukraine using the missiles to cut the supply lines for Russian forces in the ongoing counteroffensive, which we'll discuss shortly. This goes directly against Putin's warnings that they would use nuclear missiles if Ukraine started using conventional ones in Russia. But with the many warnings about nuclear weapons Putin spewed in the past 1,000 days, and with no actual response, NATO might be willing to take their chances with this. The decision to allow ATACMS came due to Ukraine already possessing significant long-range options in its kamikaze drone industry. Ukraine launched devastating drone attacks deep into Russian territory starting in September, with one of the largest attacks occurring on September 10th, and using more than 140 drones that managed to hit the Russian capital of Moscow. The other way Russia has tried to regain some prestige is by trying to take back Kursk. This time, conscripts wouldn't be quite enough, so Putin called on one of his few allies, North Korea. In mid-October, reports from South Korean intelligence started popping up, referring to the North Korean military transferring thousands of its soldiers into Russia. The first report suggested around 3,000 people were moving to the Russian Outer Manchuria region. These reports were corroborated a few days later by Ukrainian intelligence, suggesting as many as 10,000 soldiers were being transferred directly to the Kursk and Belgorod regions, the two regions where Ukraine has mounted land-based offensives. The presence of North Koreans in Russia was one of the major escalations in the war, as it constituted a direct involvement of a third-party military beyond aid and volunteer service. Ukrainian outlets suggested that North Korea might be sending as many as 12,000 troops in the first wave to Russia. Russia has used the Kursk region as proof that its territory has been threatened and points to a defense pact signed with North Korea in June of last year as justification for allowing North Korean troops inside its borders. The implication of these North Korean troops being in Kursk is quite obvious. Putin will use them to bolster troop numbers. The wording of this defense pact, which is as ambiguous as Russia's nuclear deterrence policy, implies that North Korean troops could probably only be deployed inside Russian territory. However, there's no telling whether Putin plans to stick with that restriction for long. The North Korean troops have already started clashing against Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk as part of the Russian counteroffensive, which started in September. Reports from a Russian major general suggested that by mid-October, Russia had taken back roughly 50% of the territory. However, newer reports from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense indicate that Russia actually only managed to take 40% of the occupied territory. Most of the North Korean forces, however, are still in training, and Ukrainian intelligence suggests that they might not even be of much use to Russia. This is due to the troops having significantly less training in the types of warfare widespread throughout the Ukraine-Russia front lines, as well as speaking an entirely different language. The last time North Korea was in active conflict was in 1953, when the Korean War stalled and the Korean Demilitarized Zone was created. Furthermore, North Korea received a bulk of its military equipment from the former Soviet Union, which likely puts its military industry decades out of date in some respects. Additionally, reports from North Korean defectors who are in the military suggest that soldiers typically lack training and proper nutrition, making them ineffective in actual warfare. The Russian counteroffensive in Kursk is meant to do two things. First, by retaking Kursk, Putin hopes to regain the image that Russia is actually winning the war, as Ukraine holding a part of Russia's territory would give it an edge in eventual peace negotiations. Second, by using North Korean soldiers rather than native forces, the Russian military can focus its efforts on the main front in Donbass, which is seeing more and more action by the day. The significant casualties that Russia is accruing will keep it from maintaining the upper hand in the conflict, at least for now. This is evidenced by Russia resorting to using long-range missiles and drone attacks, including using an intermediate-range ballistic missile with a range of around 3,400 miles to strike deeper into the Ukrainian military and even civilian compounds. This, plus Russia having much more artillery to spare, partially thanks to North Korea sending over 8 million rounds of artillery shells by the end of 2024, allows them to make up for its manpower losses. However, the continued presence of North Koreans on the front should alienate one of Russia's greatest allies, China. China's support for Russia in the conflict has been relegated to underhand tactics like allowing Russia to dodge economic sanctions and deepening Russia's dependence on China for money. But even that was enough to put China in the spotlight as a stern Russian ally. If the presence of North Korean troops in Russia continues, or even worse, leads to more troops coming to Russia, then NATO might be encouraged to show more support for Ukraine in turn. The escalation of the war might also push China to take an official stance on the conflict, one that could see it losing significant influence in the Indo-Pacific and Africa. These territories are the ones with whom China hopes to build favorable trade relations, so cutting them out could be a severe loss of potential for the resource-starved Chinese industry. And with former President Donald Trump now inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States, the focus has shifted to how his administration will approach the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The Biden administration in its final days made a push to approve as much aid to Ukraine as possible, anticipating the uncertainty surrounding Trump's policy on Russia and Ukraine. This puts Putin on the clock. His Kursk counteroffensive has yet to yield a decisive victory, and with parts of Russian territory still under Ukrainian control, it remains difficult for him to convincingly claim dominance in the war. Given these dynamics, Putin may view Trump's presidency as a potential opportunity to end the war on terms favorable to Russia. However, what Trump's actual approach to the conflict will be remains unclear. But what do you think? How will Trump re-entering the White House affect the Ukrainian plans? 2024 was supposed to be the year of recovery, but for who? Putin's relentless push to swell the ranks has made the Russian army one of the largest in the world, with 1.3 million active soldiers and another 2 million in reserve. But this show of force came at a steep cost on the Russian home front, one that Russia is about to pay in blood. Meanwhile, Zelensky kept Ukraine's plans for the latter half of 2024 shrouded in secrecy, offering only cryptic hints of a strategy in motion. NATO, after months of waiting, finally began delivering F-16 fighter jets in July, following Congress's approval of a $60 billion aid package in April. The first half of the year was spent preparing for war, the second half unleashing it. And yet, despite Russia's overwhelming numbers and resources, Putin is teetering on the brink of a catastrophic defeat. Russia reinvigorated its efforts to invade and occupy Ukraine in May 2024. On paper, Russia had plenty of avenues to win the war. It had the manpower advantage as a result of relentless conscription campaigns and the fact that Ukraine had a little less than half of Russia's population to begin with. It had the material advantage, being perhaps the only country that produced the ammunition that the Soviet-era tanks and artillery batteries used, and which were the main military equipment on both sides of the war. The US Congress had previously spent months bickering about sending more aid to Ukraine, believing that funding the war would be a pointless effort. Yet throughout all that, the so-called summer invasion was a resounding failure for Russia, perhaps due to the bizarre choices made by the Russian military command. You see, apart from the initial blitzkrieg attempt at reaching Kyiv from the north, which was repelled within a few months of the invasion starting, Russia has focused most of its efforts on occupying the eastern and southern points of Ukraine. The former was a relatively obvious target, with Russia already annexing Crimea 10 years ago and having a much greater geopolitical presence in the surrounding Ukrainian regions to begin with. The latter was done to prevent Ukraine from being able to export goods, as Ukraine is a significant grain exporter across the Black Sea. Therefore, most of 2023 was spent with Russia putting more pressure on the eastern side of the Russo-Ukrainian front, occupying the Donetsk region. The Russian army's next goal in the area for 2024 was naturally going to be the largest city in the region, that being Pokrovsk. The 60,000 population city is the transportation hub between the eastern front and the rest of Ukraine, so Russia was trying to capture the city as part of the 2024 summer campaign made sense in a way. However, what happened was nothing short of a moment of impulsiveness. Instead of going for the eastern front, the main Russian force during the May and June campaigns was focused on the northern city of Kharkiv. That's the same city and the same region that was under siege in the first few months of the invasion all the way back in 2022, and which the Ukrainians retook by September of that year. Additionally, rather than pressing into the Kharkiv region with armored vehicles and tanks supported by long-range artillery strikes, Russia heavily favored infantry-based tactics. From the reports in the area, Russia used cobbled-together turtle tanks, which were unwieldy armored vehicles, with the goal of absorbing as much Ukrainian fire as possible and giving more breathing room to the infantry forces. For infantry, Russians turned to equipping troops with motorcycles to give them more maneuverability and speed compared to traditional armored vehicles. Apparently, the goal of the summer campaign was to cover as much ground as possible, as fast as possible, using as little of Russia's heavy armor as necessary. This could stem from the widespread shortage of tanks that Russia could allocate to the campaign in the first place. In 2023, it became apparent that Russia was running out of modern armor. Russia's most modern battle tank was the T-90, effectively an upgraded version of the old T-72 that was manufactured throughout the Soviet era. However, Ukraine has been able to deal with the T-90s via the gifted tanks from the West and by exploiting the tank's critical weak spot under the chassis, the autoloader. Unlike the Western tanks, the T-90, as well as the T-72, uses an auto-loading mechanism that also stores excess sensitive ammunition, which is located under the turret. If an explosion, such as the one delivered by mine or drone, the latter of which Ukraine has become bona fide experts in, hits the turret, there's a chance that all the stored ammunition detonates and obliterates the tank. By removing Russia's more modern tanks from the equation, both Russia and Ukraine have mainly relied on the contingent of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72s, T-62s, and even older T-55s. The Western sanctions on Russia have prevented it from getting more modern pieces of equipment, which resulted in Russia being forced to salvage or re-equip Soviet tanks to use in the war. Even with that, a bulk of the tanks were being sent to the Eastern Front. That led to the strange situation where Russia has mainly used infantry tactics to make headway into the Kharkiv region. For the first few weeks of the summer offensive, Russia did see some progress, managing to eke some 10 miles into Ukrainian territory, but nowhere near close to the city of Kharkiv itself. The losses that Russia accumulated over the summer offensive were staggering. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the invading force contained between 30,000 and 70,000 soldiers, leading to a significant increase in daily losses incurred by Russia. Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily losses, suggests that Russia has been losing over 1,200 soldiers per day across all fronts throughout the summer offensive. Over the course of May and June, the months with the most activity on the newly opened Kharkiv front, Russia suffered around 70,000 casualties. That's a significant blow to the already failing Russian morale and attempts to improve the troop count, with many comparing the Russian tactics to feeding soldiers into a meat grinder for no apparent reason. So what was the ultimate goal behind the summer offensive? Some strategists suggest that Russia was confident that the lower estimate of 30,000 troops would be enough to dig deep into Ukrainian territory and capture Kharkiv. After all, Ukraine itself has focused its efforts on fortifying the Eastern Front, so it wasn't out of the realms of possibility to consider that Kharkiv would be sparsely defended as a result. Other tacticians believe that the Kharkiv offensive was meant as a diversion. Its goal was to make Ukraine think that Russia was putting most of its efforts into occupying Kharkiv, forcing the Ukrainian army to change gears and fall back from the Eastern Front to defend the north. Either way, Russia was planning to use Kharkiv as a means to an end, with that end being making more progress on the Eastern Front. However, all the Russians ended up doing was falling into a massive trap. The Kharkiv invasion, ill-equipped and poorly planned as it was, turned out to be a massive failure. Despite early gains, Russia couldn't maintain the momentum, and Ukraine managed to reinforce the area with minimal setbacks on the Eastern Front. The Russian army was forced to retreat relatively quickly, allowing Ukraine to retake the occupied villages near the border and proclaim victory in that battle. Granted, Russia managed to gain some territory in the east, roughly 400 square miles, but it came at the cost of 70,000 soldiers, significant losses in tanks and other armored vehicles, and the main target of Pokrovsk was still relatively safe. And remember, by the time Russia started the summer invasion, Ukraine still had yet to receive the financial and military aid that the US Congress announced in April. When the summer offensive was over, that money and equipment started to trickle into the country. Now it was up to Ukraine to make the move. And so we come to the beginning of August 2024, when Ukraine made one of the most surprising yet effective advances in the past 18 months of warfare, the invasion of Kursk. On paper, the Kursk region should have the same amount of defenses on the Russian side as Kharkiv did on the Ukrainian side. Both regions are on the border between the two countries and therefore have a high potential of being used as part of the northern front in the war. However, Ukraine went in with a much smaller contingent, some reports suggesting around 1,000 troops only, and completely swept through Russia's defenses in the area. More troops followed soon, creating an organized yet mobile invading force that could occupy one village after another without setting down permanent defenses. Ultimately, Ukraine's success came down to a few factors. One, Ukraine has managed to provide a much more effective cover and pressure via artillery fire in Kursk. The strikes focused on key military fortifications and infrastructure that could be used to reinforce the area with more troops. Satellite images of the region showed a few bridges and vital roads being destroyed throughout the region, effectively cutting the Russian army off from the mainland. Second, Russia has vastly overestimated the effectiveness of its ground forces in the area. As a result, most of the troops stationed throughout the Kursk region ended up being fresh recruits who have only had several weeks of combat training and were not exactly meant to fight on the front lines. What ended up happening with the new troops was a wave of Russians surrendering as the Ukrainian army advanced from one village to the next. Within the first week of the invasion, a Ukrainian prison that was housing prisoners of war reported processing 300 captured Russian soldiers, more than 80% of whom were newer conscripts. According to some estimates, the actual count of the prisoners could inflate by several hundred in mere weeks. Russia has also heavily underplayed the importance and the extent of the Kursk region. The initial reports made by the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that the invading army had only 300 soldiers. The subsequent report even went so far as to proclaim that the Ukrainian troops were being actively pushed back by the local troops. This was a bold-faced lie to cover up the utter failure of the Russian war machine to account for the mere possibility that Ukraine was suddenly gaining ground. Soon after, more accurate reports by the Ukrainian and Western intelligence came in, with surveys of the actual damage dealt in the Kursk region. They suggested that the invasion has caused between 120,000 and 200,000 residents of the area to become displaced, with Ukraine managed to occupy dozens of villages and slowly advance toward the administrative center of Kursk. 3 weeks after the incursion, the Russian response is still uncertain. For the most part, Russia continues to downplay the effect of the Kursk incursion on the actual progress of the war. The country's artillery has managed to slow down the Ukrainian forces and has thus far prevented them from going deeper into enemy territory. On the other hand, Russia has also scrambled to create trenches roughly 25 miles into the occupied territory. These trenches don't seem like they're going to be used as defensive positions by the Russians, though. Based on Russian actions so far and the state of the military in the region, it's likely that Ukraine can take control of these trenches and use them as stopgaps in a prolonged counter-invasion of Russia. On the other hand, Russia has reinvigorated its efforts on the Eastern Front. Reports from the last 2 weeks of August 2024 suggested that Russian forces have come as close as 7 miles to the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian government has urged the residents of the city to evacuate, but has encountered significant issues with moving large numbers of civilians so close to the renewed front lines. The reason for that is Russia's complete lack of care for Ukrainian civilians. Even before the newest waves of fighting, the Russian army has displayed utter ruthlessness when it comes to dealing with civilians. Throughout the war, Russia has frequently targeted primarily civilian areas with missiles and drones, forcing the Ukrainian military to heavily invest and ask for anti-air defensive systems, such as the US-made Patriots. The Russian airstrikes were focusing on Ukrainian hospitals, which housed both civilian and military casualties, an act which is against the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. In contrast, the Ukrainian army has made efforts to minimize civilian casualties in Kursk, working alongside international humanitarian organizations to provide aid to the people who remained in the area. The reinforcements and infrastructure that were struck by the Ukrainian airstrikes primarily had a military use, preventing Russia from reinforcing the region. Furthermore, Ukraine has shown no long-term goals to control the area it occupied during the Kursk incursion, at least according to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. This is unlike Russia's persistent efforts to annex parts of Ukraine, trying to claim the Donetsk region. President Zelensky has suggested that he's ready to present a plan to the US that outlines the terms of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Kursk is therefore meant to drive down the narrative that Ukraine is not yet ready to yield to Russia and will continue to go on the offensive. By doing so, Ukraine can get a significant edge over Russia. First, the extent of the invasion in Kursk showcases how much Ukraine can accomplish in a relatively short time with restricted access to Western resources. While Russia has managed to occupy roughly 400 square miles of Ukrainian land between January and July 2024, Ukraine currently holds some 500 square miles of the Kursk Oblast territory, all acquired within the span of 3 weeks. This gives Zelensky the confidence to ask for more resources, particularly long-range missiles, fighter jets and artillery, which would allow Ukraine to press deeper into Russia by advancing on the newly made Kursk front. This will allow Ukraine to force Russia to back away from the Eastern Front and rethink whether Kursk is an unimportant part of the wider war. Additionally, the recent allotment of aid primarily comes in the form of ammunition and anti-air missiles, which have seen consistently positive results on the Eastern Front throughout the Kursk invasion. One of the most recent Russian attacks on the Eastern Front has been a devastating airstrike with 127 missiles and 109 drones launched, according to an Al Jazeera report. Ukraine's air defenses have managed to take out 102 missiles and 99 drones, heavily reducing the damage Russia could inflict on Ukrainian military compounds, infrastructure, and even civilian areas. Russia has been getting bolder in what it terms acceptable military targets, with one drone hitting a dam only miles upstream from Kyiv. The dam suffered minimal damage and remained intact, but it showcased that Russia will not relent until it completely dominates Ukraine. To that end, the current incursion of Kursk provides a twofold solution to this problem. First, Ukraine has started to ramp up its drone attacks as well, considering that the country has heavily invested in creating a domestic military drone industry and has received long-range missiles from NATO. The current effective range of the Ukrainian drones is estimated to be roughly 1,100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. By pushing further into Russian territory, Ukraine can create a favorable position to start launching more precision strikes directly at Moscow. Until now, Moscow has been relatively untouched by the conflict. The conscription efforts were disproportionately targeting rural areas, especially people who belong to Russia's many national minorities. A PBS News interview in 2023 suggested that 6 out of 10 regions with the highest death tolls were in Siberia and the Far East, and that men from certain minorities were as much as 75 times more likely to die from the war than Muscovites. In contrast, Moscow has seen a significant brain drain in the first months of the war, with around 900,000 Russians leaving the country by the end of 2022. Many of them were blue-collar, highly skilled workers, which has largely stripped the capital of people who view the war negatively. If Ukraine manages to put direct military pressure on Moscow and give the capital a feeling of what it's like to be in an active war, it's highly likely that the public sentiment on the war will change. Even in an authoritarian regime such as Putin's, this could lead to a significant ideological shift within the country that could spell doom for the nation's leadership and geopolitical relations. But let's go back to the second reason why Ukraine's Kursk invasion can solve its air defense problems. The army's ability to withstand hostile airstrikes while advancing in enemy territory gives Zelensky more sway to ask for direct military equipment from NATO countries, primarily in the form of Patriots and other anti-air defense systems. These can prove vital if Ukraine wants to maintain its momentum and pressure Russia without receiving air retaliation. And Ukraine has one more ace up its sleeve for aerial supremacy. The F-16s have arrived. After months of training, NATO's shipment of 65 F-16s has been deemed ready to take flight over Ukraine, piloted by Ukrainian fighter pilots. The F-16 is one of the most modern fighter jets available to both sides of the conflict. Russia has the Su-27s, which were specifically made to counter the threat of the F-16 but failed to do so. The addition of F-16s aims to degrade what little is left of Russia's hope to control Ukraine via its airspace. This is why Zelensky has also been adamant about asking for even more fighter jets to defend the country. The small victory that the Ukrainian army achieved in Kursk can be seen as a precursor and a catalyst of what can be done in the wider context of the war itself. But why is airspace control vital in turning the tide of war? The answer lies in Russia's saber-rattling. During 2022 and 23, NATO efforts to end the war by providing Ukraine with more advanced military equipment have been met with resistance from Russia. Putin has frequently alluded to the possibility that there's a line that NATO cannot cross, or it risks impeding on Russia's sovereignty, which is quite rich considering the goal of the special military operation. Russia has frequently used its reserve of nuclear weapons to prevent NATO from providing full support to Ukraine under the pretense that Ukraine would use the weapons to invade Russia in turn. While that moment has happened, Ukraine has managed to occupy a portion of Russia. The Russian response was to first deny the claims, then fabricate increasingly bold lies about the state of the invasion, followed by a half-hearted attempt at securing the Kursk region while also pressuring Ukraine on the existing eastern front. Therefore, it became even more unlikely that Russia will use nuclear weaponry against Ukraine and NATO. NATO's strategy so far has been to arm Ukraine just enough so it can prolong the war, but avoid crossing Russia's lines in the sand, so to speak. The Kursk incursion and lack of Russia's nuclear responses might just give NATO the go-ahead to approve more ambitious plans to provide more comprehensive aid to Ukraine. This means that Putin is losing all his leverage against the West, and that NATO can start putting more pressure to end the war in Ukraine's favor. But there's yet another factor to consider when discussing the current war events: economies. Both Russia and Ukraine have had to heavily change how their economies function in wartime. Ukraine is using nearly $350 billion worth of financial and military equipment aid from Europe and the US to keep itself running. More specifically, the country had previously suffered greatly from Russia being able to control the Black Sea with its navy, a military force that Ukraine is sorely lacking in. However, Ukraine managed to score yet another significant victory on that front, mainly via drone warfare. Starting with the spring of 2022, Ukraine has made several attempts to create drones that were specifically made for sea-to-sea warfare. The sea-deployed Magura V5 drone was designed to deliver an explosive payload by swimming rather than flying. The first public showcases of the Magura V5s were made later in the year, damaged Russia's newest Black Sea Fleet flagship and a minesweeper. Emboldened by the success, Ukrainians began to use the drones more offensively and supported their sea-based attacks with traditional air-to-surface strikes deeper into Russia's territory to cut off access to the Black Sea. The result was 26 sunk or damaged ships in the Russian fleet, forcing Russia to withdraw from Sevastopol in October 2023. This allowed Ukraine to reopen some of its previous maritime trading routes and start exporting across the Black Sea. By August 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the reopened Black Sea corridor had been used by 2,300 ships over the past year, and that grain exports were slowly starting to reach pre-war numbers. This effectively means the country doesn't solely need to rely on financial aid to get its economy up and running. In contrast, Russia's economy has become more isolationist than ever. In response to the invasion, the EU has stopped Russia's oil and gas exports. In response, Russia has been forced to find new clients, namely China and India. But the deal with China comes with significant caveats. The price of natural gas was purported to be roughly half of what Russia was achieving on the Western market, limiting its options to create income from selling natural resources. The US has also posed significant economic sanctions on Russia, preventing the country from trading in US dollars or obtaining any technology or equipment that could be construed as being used militarily. The short-term effect of the sweeping trade changes was that China and Russia achieved record trade volume in 2023 at over $240 billion. However, even that doesn't seem like it'll work out in Russia's favor in the long run. While the total trade has managed to grow slightly, the oil trade has actually seen a decline in 2024 so far compared to 2023, and the prices are unstable. Furthermore, Russia's economy has evidently gone all in on supplying the war effort. The 2024 budget has allocated around 39% of the government funding to military and national defense, a staggering figure compared to the rest of the world. Russia has now one of the highest military spending figures, both in total and as a percentage of GDP, 6% compared to the US's 3.4%, China's 1.7%, and NATO's 2.7% average. This can be attributed to the country's blossoming energy sector, which is again a response to Russia's heavy reliance on exporting oil and natural gas. The energy sector has the potential to create an even greater imbalance in employment opportunities for Russian citizens. If the energy sector is more lucrative than, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture, Russia will see a significant shift in energy companies gaining employees at the expense of other industries. The newly minted middle and upper classes will create a demand for the service sector, which will again drain the less desirable industrial sectors. But the process can only continue as long as the energy sector continues to grow, and that growth isn't sustainable. Furthermore, the downfall of the other sectors will force Russia to depend on importing more and more from neighboring countries, typically China or the former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Ultimately, this gives China far greater control of Russia's geopolitics than Putin might feel comfortable with. If China decides to pull the plug on Russian exports as a result of US pressure, Russia's economy might be facing a downturn, which will halt the country's militaristic ambitions. When the invasion started, and over the course of the following 2 years, Russia was hoping to use its resource advantage to drain Ukraine's resources and win by plowing over what was left of the country when the latter's military was annihilated. However, the recent events in Kursk have shown that Ukrainians have plenty of fight left in them, and that the world no longer has much to fear from Russia's nuclear arsenal. With Russia's military proving to be at an increasing disadvantage compared to Ukrainian troops bolstered by NATO, Russia's economy propped up by China and already past the point of no return, and Putin unable to manipulate NATO into standing down, Russia has pretty much run out of options. We might see that the closing months of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 become the effective end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If that happens, Putin is unlikely to have much ground to make demands for peace will be enforced on Russia, and it might spell doom for Russia as a country itself. But what do you think? Does the Kursk invasion of Russia mean that Ukraine is on a quick path to victory, or will the war continue for a few more years? Ukraine just pulled off one of the smartest and most brutal traps of the war, and Putin's tanks paid the price. Putin thought he had this in the bag. He threw 50,000 troops at Kursk, including 10,000 North Koreans, convinced it'd be an easy win. He was sure his unstoppable tanks would crush Ukraine's forces and make him look like a hero for taking back Russian land. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Not even close. Instead, Ukraine saw him coming a mile away, literally, and set up a trap so devastating it left fields covered with burnt-out husks of Russian tanks. Russia's mighty counteroffensive? More like a total disaster. So how did Ukraine pull this off? And why does Putin keep falling for the same tricks? In this video, we're breaking down how Ukraine outsmarted Russia again, the massive losses Putin's forces suffered, and what this means for Kursk going forward. We start with the trap. For much of the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been trying to create a foothold for itself on the east side of the Snagost River. The goal is clear: squeeze out Ukraine's bridgehead in Kursk by stifling the route supplies take to the troops it's stationed in the region's north. And Russia has enjoyed some success with this approach. RBC Ukraine says that it's likely the Ukrainian units have withdrawn from fortified positions in Kursk's Olivsky Forest, with those soldiers moving back toward Mala-Loknaya. They've also withdrawn from Deryino, which lies just beyond the Snagost River. But Russia wanted more. Putin's forces intended to capture every settlement they possibly could along the river, essentially creating a buffer zone to prevent Ukraine's troops from moving supplies through the north of Kursk. So far, Russia has failed in these attempts. The Snagost River serves as a natural barrier against Russia's forces, which is why Ukraine chose to fortify around it. And on the other side of that river sit soldiers in elevated positions who are able to see Russia coming and pick off troops and mechanized divisions. So Russia has found itself almost stalemated around the Snagost River. Putin wisely decided to change his approach. Rather than throwing soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications around the river, he switched to dedicating most of his soldiers to breaking through the front lines from the north in Tolsty Lug. The goal remains the same: cut off the Ukrainian supply lines running through the north of the territory it's claimed in Kursk. However, taking Tolsty Lug also means that Russia can conduct even more direct attacks against the Novoivanovka region to Kursk's east. That's a key position for Ukraine. Putin tried to take the settlement at the beginning of the Kursk counteroffensive. Those early attempts failed. Ukraine managed to withstand 5 waves of Russian attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on Russia in the process. Estimates suggest that at least 300 Russian and North Korean troops were killed or wounded in the 5 assaults leading up to November 11th. Ukraine also managed to destroy at least 18 of the 29 pieces of heavy equipment Putin deployed in these offensives, offering a hint that Ukraine was well prepared to spring the trap that it sprung in early December. Back to the December movements. Putin knew that taking Tolsty Lug would allow him to conduct attacks on Novoivanovka from 2 fronts, stretching Ukraine's forces in the region. So the initial Russian attack began. Euromaidan Press says that Russia sent several armored personnel carriers, or APCs, into a large water reservoir in the north of Tolstoy Lug. Their goal was to bypass that reservoir, opening the door for more Russian forces to stream into the region so they could overwhelm Ukraine's forces. The problem for Putin was that Russia had attempted to use this route before during his early attempts to retake Novoivanovka. Ukraine knew he would try again. So it set up constant surveillance in the region using drones carrying thermal imaging equipment to serve as an early warning system throughout the reservoir region. That system was triggered when Putin sent his APCs and Ukraine got to work. Upon detecting the Russian vehicles, Ukraine launched a volley of Javelin anti-tank missiles at the convoy. The Javelin is a man-portable weapon system with an effective firing range of about 1.5 miles. Their missiles are equipped with high-explosive anti-tank, or HEAT, warheads that are capable of penetrating armored steel over 6 times the diameter of the warhead itself, perfect for taking out heavy machinery. Ukraine has used javelins to great effect to take out tanks on its territory during the war. This usage was no different. In minutes, the javelins had made short work of Russia's APCs, leaving the vehicles smoking on the ground. The few Russian soldiers who managed to escape the fiery wreckages of their vehicles attempted to escape into nearby trees, but Ukraine was prepared for that too. First-person view, or FPV drones, were also present around the reservoir. Ukraine used them to track down the soldiers who were now on foot, neutralizing them so that the first wave of Russia's offensive completely broke down. That sounds like a great trap, right? Only that wasn't Ukraine's anti-tank trap. It was just an example of how far ahead Ukraine's thinking is when it comes to anticipating Putin's troop movements. Ukraine would also have known that the purpose of this initial attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolsty Lug was less about success for Russia and more about figuring out where Ukraine's firing positions were located. Russia now had that information. It sacrificed its APCs to work out where Ukraine would fire from and how quickly it would respond to an attack. Thinking that they knew what they were walking into, the Russian troops plowed forward. Several large waves, each containing between 6 and 10 armored vehicles, including tanks and fighting vehicles, attempted to push through. Those vehicles were accompanied by infantry units, with Russia's idea being to overwhelm what it thought were the only Ukrainian firing positions. It's a strategy that Putin has used constantly throughout the war. Figure out where the enemy is and then just throw soldiers and equipment at the position until their lines are penetrated and they're either destroyed or forced to retreat. The problem is that Ukraine has seen this time and time again. And it was ready. Long before Russia sent its APCs into the reservoir to work out where Ukraine's firing positions were, Ukraine had mined the fields surrounding that key position extensively. As soon as the Russian forces discovered those mines, they saw they couldn't simply circumvent Ukraine's firing positions. Doing so would mean driving their tanks over fields filled with explosives that would destroy their mechanized convoys before they get close to Ukraine. So the Russian waves of tanks had no choice but to follow the singular route Ukraine had created for them, a route that took those tanks directly through a region where they didn't want to be. And the trap was sprung. Several of the Russian vehicles and tanks were immobilized on Dragon's Teeth that Ukraine had set up on the only road Russia was able to travel. Ever since World War II, these small concrete pyramids have stopped tanks in their tracks, leaving them open for counterattacks. The Ukraine war has showed us that Putin still has an antiquated view of ground warfare in many respects. He relies on trenches and tanks to take positions. By using mines to force Russia's tanks to take the route it wanted them to take, Ukraine was able to lead many of them directly onto Dragon's Teeth, immobilizing them and removing their threat. The few tanks that managed to navigate the Dragon's Teeth had other problems. They were out in the open and directly in the sights of Ukraine's firing lines. Each wave Russia sent was met with artillery strikes, javelin missiles, and FPV drone assaults, and the tanks just kept coming. Mechanized assault after mechanized assault fell victim to the same trap, suggesting that the Russian soldiers simply had no clue what to do. Retreat wasn't an option. All the tanks could do was attempt to push forward, while troops from Ukraine's 225th Assault Battalion and 36th Marine Brigade pelted them with munitions. Images from the battlefield published on social media platforms show the extent of the damage. Entire fields are cluttered with the burnt-out shells of tanks and armored vehicles throughout Tolstoy Lug, Nizhny Klin, and Zeleny Shlyak. Some of the tanks were victims of Ukraine's cleverly placed mines. Russia thought it had outsmarted Ukraine by identifying its firing positions and attempting to circumvent them via the surrounding fields. Each tank that went up in flames following the explosion of a mine revealed that Ukraine knew exactly what Putin's forces were up to long before they even sent in the first APC wave. Other tanks lie immobile on Dragon's Teeth, not destroyed but still abandoned by their crews, and more fell victim to javelin and artillery fire, being turned into smoking husks while trapped in a firing line that Ukraine brilliantly tricked them into following. Euromaiden describes the scene as a graveyard of tanks and other armored vehicles. There can be no more accurate description. Putin's forces were humiliated in their attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolstoy Lug. They're still no closer to taking Novoivanovka, and Putin is going to be forced to rethink his strategy once more. The odds are that he'll just land on throwing more soldiers and equipment at the Ukrainian positions, because if he's shown us nothing else during this special military operation, it's that he's willing to sacrifice his soldiers to get what he wants. All of this was a bad enough humiliation for Russia, but it gets worse. Russia is still trying to push through to Novoivanovka. The difference now is that it's trying to rely on pure infantry assaults, according to Ukraine's 24th Assault Battalion. Russia's armor, its tanks and fighting vehicles were destroyed so quickly by Ukraine's trap that it doesn't have any left to restock its troops. The 24th Assault Battalion believes that the few reserves Russia has in its warehouse in Kursk have now been exhausted. Putin's only strategy now is to throw soldiers at the Ukrainian positions on foot. That isn't going to work. Ukraine has already shown how easily it can pick off the soldiers who escape their flaming vehicles using FPV drones. The Russian soldiers who are trying to break through on foot now are little more than sitting ducks for a Ukraine that was more than ready for the predictable tactics Putin would use to try and take Novoivanovka. Right now, Vladimir Putin and his cronies are trying to figure out what went wrong in Tolstoy Lug. We have some answers. Russia's first problem was that it completely underestimated Ukraine's strength around the Tolstoy Lug region. That shouldn't have happened. Putin had tried to push through the region before. His assaults leading up to the November 11th failure showed us that. And Ukraine had an inkling that he would try to do it again. That inkling led to Ukraine setting up its FPV drones to surveil the area, meaning it saw Russia's APCs coming, and with the APCs came the likelihood of waves of mechanized units to follow. For some reason, Putin seemed to think that he could try the same thing that had failed weeks before and achieve better results. He didn't seem to realize that Ukraine would use the weeks between November 11th and the beginning of December to further fortify its positions around Novoivanovka in preparation for another assault. Russia's approach has become too predictable, and that's been a problem for Putin for over a decade and a half at this point. As European Security and Defense points out, Putin has been making the same mistakes in Ukraine that he made during his ill-fated attempt to invade Georgia in 2008. That conflict, sometimes mockingly referred to as the 5-Day War because of its brevity, saw Russia attempt to invade Georgia with poorly trained conscripts who lacked the proper training for a ground offensive. It also exposed a raft of technical issues in Russia's military. Its communication systems were so antiquated that they were easy prey for Georgia's electronic warfare tactics. The country's equipment was also in poor repair, with far too much of it breaking down and becoming unusable during Russia's march into Georgia. Once Russia finally arrived into Georgia, its troops were exhausted and the Georgians were ready for them. Over the course of 5 days, Georgia destroyed, damaged, or captured 93 pieces of Russian military equipment, including 4 tanks, 21 infantry fighting vehicles, and 8 aircraft. Logistics were poor, rear support barely existed. Russia basically went into Georgia, feeling that it could steamroll the country using manpower and larger equipment numbers, only for that strategy to fall flat on its face. Does that sound familiar? Despite the Russian armed forces supposedly undergoing extensive reforms in the wake of the Georgia debacle, not a lot has changed in the country's approach now that it's fighting Ukraine. It's still sending poorly trained conscripts to the front lines to get them torn up by its enemy's guns and artillery. Equipment breakdowns are as common as they ever were, and Putin has shown that his tactical nous extends to sending in tanks and troops while relying on better numbers to overwhelm positions. It's all so predictable. And it's this predictability that allowed Ukraine to spring its anti-tank trap. It knew exactly what Russia was going to try, because it had both tried it before and had consistently failed to evolve its tactics during nearly 3 years of war. The Tolstoy Lug tank trap is just one of many examples of Ukraine cleverly predicting what Russia will do next. But there are a lot of other reasons Russia lost. Ukraine's understanding of layered defense also played a massive role. Euromaiden says that Ukraine's use of layered defenses played a huge role in allowing it to successfully spring its trap against Russia. You've seen how this defensive strategy works in our recounting of the incident. The Javelins and FPV drones Ukraine used when Russia sent in its APCs acted as the first layer. The mines planted in the field were the second, with the Dragon's teeth lining the path that Ukraine forced Russia to take being the third. Then there was another layer, more drones and Javelins along with artillery. A December 2022 article published in the Defense Post highlights that this layered defense is nothing new for Ukraine. When tackling Russia's own drones, Ukraine relies on combining aircraft and drone patrols with ground-based anti-air missiles and small units of soldiers on the ground. You'll see plenty of parallels with its approach to the Russian tanks in Tolstoy Lug here. Ukraine doesn't rely on a single form of defense to block Russian advantages. It creates several, often using them in stages to force Russia to act in the way that Ukraine wants it to act. It's very intelligent defending. And the fact that Russia still doesn't seem to be able to figure it out tells us a lot about Putin's tactical ineptitude. As soon as the mechanized divisions trying to bypass the reservoir in Tolstoy Lug discovered the mines in the field, they should have known that Ukraine was leading them into a trap. A retreat and regrouping should have followed, with Russia coming up with an alternative way to assault Novoivanovka, even if that meant losing a few tanks to Javelin strikes during the escape. But no, Russia kept moving forward into the next layer and then the next, and then its tanks were decimated as a result. Putin's mistake here is that he just doesn't learn. Coupled with his failures to adapt his tactics, you get a 1-2 punch of strategic fragility that allowed Ukraine to set its trap. Then there's the equipment problem, another massive blunder on Russia's part. Russia's forces are now trying to break through to Novoivanovka on foot, telling us that something's gone wrong with the supply lines that are supposed to be feeding them the tanks and armored vehicles they need for the assaults. What's gone wrong is simple: Russia is running out of equipment. Forbes also reported on Ukraine setting up what it dubbed a road of death on the road moving past Zeleny Shlyak. It's the road that Russia attempted to take into Novoivanovka. Forbes reported on a video that shows at least 10 destroyed vehicles along the road, with the 225th Assault Battalion claiming that the fields are mined, the road is targeted by our artillery, and every movement is carefully monitored. Forbes reports that Putin is sticking to the same strategy of constantly attacking down the road near Zeleny Shlyak, and the tale the images from the Road of Death tell is of a Russia that's running out of equipment. During the initial assaults in October and into early November, Russia used BTR-82 infantry fighting vehicles. Apparently, soldiers on the front lines in Kursk received at least 40 of those vehicles. Fast forward to December, and those BTR-82s are running out. The new wreckages on the Road of Death appear to be BMP and BMD tracked fighting vehicles, a definite downgrade from the BTR-82, along with some armored tractors and Buran trucks. It won't be long before these weaker vehicles will disappear too, forcing Russia into relying on whatever makeshift mechanized units it can provide to its soldiers, assuming it sends any at all. Just a quick reminder, this is Russia fighting in its own country. It looks like Putin is either running out of armored vehicles inside Russia, or he's done such a bad job of setting up logistics that the vehicles Russia does have aren't getting to the soldiers who need them. Things are getting so bad for Russia that it's being forced to use trucks in place of tanks, and when those trucks run out, it's sending soldiers on foot. Between August 6th and November 26th, Russia lost 364 units of heavy equipment, ranging from tanks to trucks. With the Tolstoy Lug trap sprung, it's just lost dozens more of those vital pieces of equipment. So what does all of this mean for Ukraine's attempts to defend Kursk? On the one hand, Russia is enjoying some success. It's managed to take back about 40% of the territory Ukraine claimed during its initial incursion. Having 50,000 soldiers versus 20,000 is an advantage there. Putin's meat grinder tactics have worked to a point. But on the other hand, Tolstoy Lug shows us that Russia still hasn't figured out how to attack the most fortified positions Ukraine has in Kursk. Instead, it's just trying to batter them down with tanks and infantry, with both falling prey to Ukraine's layered defenses and superior tactics. Will Ukraine manage to repel Russia's counteroffensive? That remains to be seen, but what we can tell from this one incident is that Ukraine is outsmarting Russia every step of the way. If Russia manages to retake Kursk, it'll do so at the cost of tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of units of heavy equipment. A Pyrrhic victory, if there ever was one, for a nation that's already struggling with manpower and equipment problems. But what do you think about the trap that Ukraine sprung in Tolsty Lug? Will Ukraine be able to keep using traps like these to keep Russia's soldiers at bay? Or is it only a matter of time before Putin has sacrificed enough troops and equipment to break down the Ukrainians' layered defenses? After embarrassing itself on the Ukrainian battlefield for most of 2022 and 2023, Russia seemed to turn things around in the first few months of 2024, taking advantage of the fact that the $61 billion Ukrainian military aid package from the US was stalled in Congress. The country finally managed to regain battlefield initiative and capture some key territories. The Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka fell under Russian control. The villages of Semenivka, Pervomaiska, and Novobakhmutivka followed suit. After fierce battles raging around Chasiv Yar, a city pivotal for Russian advances in the Donetsk Oblast, Russia managed to capture parts of it. The Ukrainian forces started retreating from several areas of the Donbass after being badly outgunned and outmanned by their Russian foes. In other words, everything was falling into place for Russia. So you'd think that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be pretty confident and secure in his position, right? Wrong. It's quite the opposite, really. As July was nearing its end, Putin was in full panic mode. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022, one realization seems to have started settling in. Russia may have lost the war in Ukraine. But how did we get here? What caused Putin, a man known for his ruthless calculation and steely resolve, to face such crushing dread? And how did Russia go from seeming triumph to the precipice of defeat? We've got all the answers for you in this video. After hearing that Putin is in full panic mode, you might understandably ask a single question. How do you know that? After all, it's not like Putin is likely to broadcast his fears for the world to see. Well, the truth is that actions often speak louder than words. And even the words used often reek of desperation and fear, even though they're meant to project power. As hard as Russia is trying to keep this facade of strength, the cracks are beginning to show. So before examining what made Putin go into full panic mode, let's take a closer look at the key signs of his crumbling confidence. Putin's shocking cabinet reshuffle in May of 2024 was the first major sign that he felt his grip on power weakening. In a move that sent shockwaves around the globe, Putin replaced his long-standing Minister of Defense and longtime friend and close ally, Sergei Shoigu, with an economist with no military experience, Andrei Belyusov. Now, for the most part, this move was seen as the most obvious sign that Russia was placing its economy on a war footing, preparing for a long war in Ukraine and beyond. But beneath the surface, this reshuffle signaled more than just an economic pivot. It signaled that Putin's worst fear, the rise of his Kremlin rivals, was potentially becoming a reality once again. And after the disastrous impact of Yevgeny Prigozhin's June 2023 rebellion, Putin couldn't take any chances. By removing Shoigu from his post, Putin effectively neutralized an ally who became a little too powerful for Putin's liking. Most Russians perceived Shoigu as a familiar and respected minister who had served Russia honorably for 12 years. Putin also believed this before the invasion of Ukraine, sharing quite a close and public friendship with Shoigu. But as the situation in Ukraine worsened, the Russian public had to bid farewell to the many macho photos of Putin and Shoigu sunbathing bare-chested in Siberia, going on fishing trips and playing hockey. The choice between friendship and power proved to be an easy one for Putin. And that's precisely what the Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava believes Putin achieved by removing Shoigu from his cabinet. He removed any threat to his power. Shoigu's replacement, Belyusov, described as a trustworthy bureaucrat, is only interested in economic matters. He has no ambitions to lead the Russian armed forces, build a parallel power base, or even meddle in important military issues. The general staff of the Russian armed forces will be in charge of those, while Belyusov focuses on securing the necessary funding for Russia's war machine. Belyusov also doesn't have a loyal base of supporters like Shoigu. He's just a scientist who owes his position to Putin alone, and thus Putin alone warrants his loyalty. To secure this loyalty from other key figures in the cabinet, Putin started appointing their children to high-profile positions and lucrative state contracts. So Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, who many consider to be the second most powerful man in Russia, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister for Agriculture. Similarly, Boris Kovalchuk, the son of Yuri Kovalchuk, reputed to be Putin's personal banker, became the chairman of the Accounts Chamber of Russia. Through these moves, Putin is also securing the loyalty of the next generation of political leaders, eliminating future threats to his regime. Of course, there are no guarantees in the cruel world of politics, as Prigozhin proved, so Putin's efforts to fortify his position are fraught with risk. But even if they weren't, even if they were rock solid, the mere fact that Putin was forced to make these moves speaks volumes about his current state of mind. So do Putin's threats of nuclear war. Now, we know what you're thinking, old news. And yes, Putin has been threatening to deploy nuclear weapons virtually since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. However, the threats and this dangerous rhetoric dramatically intensified in the last few months, clearly showing just how desperate and panicked Putin is. In an effort to convince the world he isn't bluffing once again, he reiterated that Russia would use all means at its disposal to protect its sovereignty at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He added, "For some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it." Conveniently ignoring the very reason for this belief is his history of making empty threats and nuclear saber-rattling. Of course, Russian officials, state media, and publications are quick to take Putin's word for it, plastering nuclear threats across headlines and broadcasting them with fervor. But these threats aren't the only outlandish thing the Russian media keeps pushing. Believe it or not, Russia's state-controlled media outlets are now trying to convince Russian people to join the war by promising them that they will be resurrected if they get killed on the battlefield. Yep, you heard that right. The state media is also painting Russia's invasion as a holy war, presenting the Russian armed forces as the embodiment of the forces of good and describing individual soldiers as the forerunners of Jesus' forces. It's a lethal mix of delusion and desperation. However, in actuality, the desperation in this department is quite justified, given how many troops Russia has lost in Ukraine. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 570,120 troops. Combine this staggering number of casualties with the two waves of forced mobilization, 137,000 troops in August 2022 and 170,000 troops in December 2023, combined with the 300,000 Russian citizens who had fled the country, and it becomes obvious that the Kremlin is facing a dire manpower crisis. The fact that he's gradually running out of soldiers to send to certain death might have contributed to Putin's apparent readiness to hold peace talks, announced on June 14th. While this would surely be monumental news coming from any other warring leader, in Putin's case it's tinged with skepticism, especially when the terms Putin proposes for this peace initiative heavily favor Russia's strategic interests rather than offering any genuine concessions. According to him, fighting would stop if Ukraine would withdraw its troops from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts and refuse to join NATO. Ukraine, on its part, slammed this proposition as an ultimatum, labeling his options for ending the war as absurd. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, also added that these statements contained nothing new. But Minister Kuleba is wrong. There is something new in Putin's June 14th statement, a hint of desperation. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the first to point this out publicly. During the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Rutte said that Putin's alleged readiness to hold peace talks indicates that he's panicking. His exact words were, "Obviously, since he came up with this crazy proposal for peace yesterday, it shows us that he's panicking." However, Rutte still seems to believe peace is possible for the war in Ukraine and that it could be achieved at a similar summit. In fact, the Dutch official voiced his disappointment over Putin not attending the June 2024 summit in Switzerland, saying, "The train will not move without Russia." To be fair, Russia and Putin weren't invited to attend the Global Peace Summit, which ended up hosting about 100 delegations with 57 heads of state and governments from all over the world. However, the reason why Russia wasn't invited was the country's public flagging that it would not participate. But even if it did, it would hardly change anything. Putin needs the war in Ukraine to continue for his regime to survive. If the war comes to an end, regardless of the side that prevails, he will be left to grapple with the disastrous consequences of his war economy that Russians will no longer be able to ignore. Then again, Russians are already starting to catch on, despite the relentless propaganda keeping them in the dark. And they have a single item to thank, the first reason on our list for Putin to panic: eggs. That's right, eggs have come to symbolize the economic turmoil in Russia. They've become so expensive that they're even sold individually in some shops, going for as high as 23 cents an egg. Of course, they aren't alone, with numerous other basic ingredients soaring in price due to massive labor market shortages, high energy costs, and the plunging ruble. The situation has gotten so dire that Putin fears Russians might take to the streets to protest. This is also the first of many occurrences that set off Putin's panic mode, which we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Putin fears the rise of Kremlin rivals, he also fears the power of public unrest. That's why his regime ordered the Russian security services to take action and finally address the shocking prices and shortage of eggs and other staples. Russia is even resorting to importing eggs from Turkey and Azerbaijan to fill the gap, a stark contrast to the 98% of nationally sourced eggs before the war. Of course, eggs are far from the only reason why Putin is in full panic mode, and far from the most crucial one. That honor belongs to the second reason on our list, which is that Ukraine is now allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets on Russian soil. This monumental decision came in May 2024, when ally after ally started giving Ukraine the green light on the matter, instantly sending Putin into full panic mode. You see, before May, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons on Russian targets within Ukrainian territory, that is, the parts occupied by Russia. This allowed Russia to wreak havoc all across Ukraine, while Ukraine was only allowed to respond within the confines of its own borders. With this new change of policy, Ukraine can use a wide variety of advanced weaponry to strike Russian targets beyond the occupied Ukrainian regions. However, there's also a major but involved. Ukraine can target Russian territory, but only within specific areas and military targets. For instance, the Russian armed forces launched a massive offensive in the Kharkiv region on May 10th, so the US allowed Ukraine to hit the Russian targets surrounding this border region, which were heavily involved in carrying out this offensive. Other countries like France, Germany, and the UK followed suit, allowing Ukraine to do the same with the weapons they supplied. But what kinds of weapons are we talking about here? Well, Ukraine can use most of its air defense systems, rockets, and artillery. Long-range missiles are still off limits, but this new policy shift opens up a range of high-impact options. To be more specific, Ukraine can now use the following weapons and equipment to strike predefined targets in Russia: the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jet supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark, Su-25 close air support jets donated by Northern Macedonia, Scalp Egg air-launched cruise missiles supplied by France, Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles delivered by the UK, the Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles provided by Turkey, and HIMARS and ATACMS missiles supplied by Germany, the US, UK, and Norway. Of course, the permission to use these weapons on Russian soil alone is by no means enough for Ukraine to win the war. However, it's more than enough to finally shift the balance of power and give Russia the taste of its own medicine. As an anonymous senior Ukrainian officer put it in a call with CNN, the Russian military can no longer feel impunity and security. The newly granted permission has already had a huge impact, allowing Ukraine to destroy several important targets inside Russia and conduct a successful counteroffensive. It's also stopped Russia from targeting the Kharkiv region with its S-300 and S-400 systems. How so? Ukraine started carrying out strikes on targets in the Belgorod region using the HIMARS missiles, which forced the Russians to move their surface-to-air missile systems much further away, putting ground targets in Kharkiv out of their range, that range being 75 miles for the S-300 system and 120 miles for its S-400 counterparts. As for the aerial targets like aircraft and missiles, both systems have an operational range of 250 miles. When struck by Ukrainian HIMARS, these systems were located roughly 40 miles from the front line in the Kharkiv region and 50 miles from the city of Kharkiv itself. Safeguarding Kharkiv from the S-300 threat has provided significant relief to the city of Kharkiv, which is also targeted by aerial glide bombs dropped from fighter jets from a distance of some 40 miles. However, there's one particular target that seems to be inducing the most panic in the Kremlin: the Crimean Bridge. As its name suggests, the 12-mile bridge is located on the Crimean Peninsula and serves as a crucial artery connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Since its construction in 2018, this bridge, also known as the Kerch Strait Bridge, has facilitated the movement of Russian troops, supplies, and resources between the peninsula and the mainland. However, the bridge has also served as a symbol of Russian control and a testament to Moscow's claims over Crimea, which makes it one of the prime targets for Ukrainian forces. So far, Ukraine has managed to hit the bridge twice, in October 2022 and July 2023. Both times, strike drones were involved in the attack. While these strikes managed to badly damage parts of the bridge, they failed to achieve Ukraine's ultimate goal, completely severing Russia's crucial supply line to Crimea. But the newly delivered ATACMS, a coveted long-range missile system manufactured in the US with a range of up to 190 miles, could change this. That's why the renewed flow of military aid from the US to Ukraine is another source of panic for Putin and the Kremlin, the third on our list. But how do we know Ukraine is eyeing the Crimean Bridge? Well, besides the obvious strategic value of this bridge, a senior Ukrainian diplomat has also dropped a major hint. In a post shared to X, formerly Twitter, Sergei Kyslytsya, Ukraine's permanent representative in the United Nations, listed 6 main types of bridges. Each of the types was accompanied by a diagram showing what the bridge type looks like. But in the 6th slot, there weren't any bridges, just an empty space with the words Kerch. For those who can read between the lines, the message was more than clear. The Kerch Bridge will be no more. The 4th reason for Putin's justified panic is the overall change in how the West approaches the war. For the better part of almost 30 months of warfare, the US and Western allies weren't going all in to help Ukraine. First, the West was wary of provoking Russia too much, fearing the escalation that might ensue. It's almost as if Ukraine wasn't allowed to win the war because of what a Russian loss might mean for the rest of Europe. Next, the West was seemingly hoping Putin would stop at some point, realizing that his aggressive expansionism would ultimately be unsustainable and self-defeating. This is also partially why the US waited for so long before greenlighting the use of its weapons inside Russia. Think of it this way: Ukraine doesn't want the war to continue, the US doesn't want the war to continue, NATO doesn't want the war to continue, and the rest of the world doesn't want the war to continue. It was only logical to assume that Russia could also be added to that list. Unfortunately, it became evident that Putin had no intention of stopping. In addition, he's obviously looking to expand the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. As a result, the West finally realized that a change of tactics was more than necessary. So the strategy is no longer Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. The strategy is now Ukraine will win the war. Ukrainian armed forces have seemingly sensed the change, lending them to fight more valiantly than ever. This leads us to the fifth source of Putin's panic: Ukraine's everlasting resilience. Even though Ukrainian forces are the ones heavily outgunned and outnumbered, the Russian troops are the ones taking more hits. According to Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia suffers 3 times the number of casualties than Ukraine. In some areas, this ratio is even higher. Russia has also suffered heavy equipment losses since the beginning of the invasion. According to the July 24th report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost the following equipment in the war: 8,302 tanks, 16,013 armored fighting vehicles, 21,279 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,759 artillery systems, 1,125 multiple launch rocket systems, 902 air defense systems, 363 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,544 drones, 28 ships and boats, 1 submarine. Of course, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in this department as well, but not before taking full advantage of the equipment. For instance, a UK-based think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, estimated that Ukraine loses a staggering 10,000 drones monthly, but this high figure has to do with Ukraine's aggressive use of drones in combat roles. Simply put, Ukrainian drones have been wreaking havoc on Russia. They are the reason the Black Sea Fleet has all but retreated from Crimea, despite standing against a country that has virtually no navy. Ukraine has also been using drones to sow panic and fear across Russia, wiping out major targets in the process. The targets in question are mostly air bases, oil depots, and industrial sites. In other words, locations whose destruction can disrupt Putin's relentless war machine. In one of the latest attacks, 47 drones targeted the Rostov region, badly damaging the Morozovsk airbase, home to various Russian fighter jets, including Su-34s, Su-24s, and Su-24Ms. The 5 areas that were hit were the location of an S-300-400 air defense system, the parking area of an Su-24 fighter jet, another parking area for fighter jets, a fuel and lubricants warehouse, and the runway. With strategic moves aimed at appeasing the people of Russia and its government, it's clear that Ukraine remains the biggest threat to the survival of Putin's regime. After all, we're talking about a man who takes out his opponents almost preemptively before they get a real chance to threaten his grip on power. Think Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. So the fact that this great enemy of Russia, Ukraine, just won't relent and continues to challenge his authority is a source of profound anxiety for Putin. The same goes for his many miscalculations in the war in Ukraine, the sixth source of panic. Remember, the very invasion of Ukraine was launched based on a miscalculation. Putin's yes men promised him that he could take Kyiv in 3 days or so after swarming it with 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles. Of course, this didn't happen. Kyiv is still very much standing. Since the beginning of the invasion, there has been one miscalculation after another, and even Putin, despite his usual arrogance, can't ignore the mounting evidence of his errors. Speaking of his miscalculations, another international one is sure to make Putin sweat: Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 US presidential race. You see, Putin was all but convinced that Donald Trump would get re-elected in November, as his opponent was widely painted as an old and sickly man who can't be trusted to lead the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, this worked in Putin's favor, as Trump famously promised to shake up NATO, even threatening to pull the US from the alliance altogether. With a weakened NATO, Putin would have little trouble advancing his strategic ambitions, both in Ukraine and beyond. But Putin's dreams of an easy path to victory were shattered on July 21, 2024, when it was announced that Biden would no longer run for re-election and that he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as his replacement. The news stirred up quite the commotion in the US and the rest of the world, Russia very much included. Russian state officials started complaining on national TV that Biden's move was a disaster for Trump's re-election chances. As Oleg Matveyev, a member of the State Duma, put it, previously, Trump could easily attack Biden's health. Now he has nothing left to attack. He added that Trump's campaign switched to attacking Harris, but nothing new will stick to her. Of course, the US presidential race is far from over, but it's easy to see why Putin and those around him are panicking. If elected, Harris's policy toward Ukraine is likely to remain similar to Biden's, which means support for as long as it takes. Harris has previously attended 3 consecutive Munich security conferences, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at each. Though her first appearance was 5 days before the full-scale invasion started, Harris used the other 2 meetings with Zelensky to reiterate US support for Ukraine. Harris has also continuously reiterated that Russia must pay for its war crimes, which shouldn't be surprising, given her background as Attorney General. She also insists that the only way for the war in Ukraine to end is with Ukraine as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. So there you have it. Putin's full panic mode now makes much more sense, doesn't it? But the good news is that the West still has a few cards up its sleeve, which could easily push Putin into an even deeper state of desperation. The first is to allow Ukraine to hit more targets using Western-supplied weapons. Though lifting all limitations is the ultimate goal, even a simple expansion beyond areas directly targeting Ukraine would do wonders for the country's war effort. Ideally, Ukraine should be able to hit Moscow, because there's no more important city in the entire country. Russia is Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. For now, the people of Moscow are mostly unaware of the war raging some 500 miles away. Sure, they've experienced the fluctuating economy, but they have no idea of the full scale of devastation and chaos unfolding in Ukraine. The Russian elites were a bit shaken when the war first started, but by now they're used to it, giving it no second thought in their day-to-day lives. So the only way to truly get to Putin is to make Russia feel the war. As the Ukrainian historian Yuri Felshtinsky puts it, Felshtinsky believes that it's also the only way to ultimately defeat Russia and prevent further escalation. The West, and the US in particular, can also instill more fear in Putin by providing additional military aid to Ukraine. After all, in the 5 months when US aid was withheld was when Russia turned the tables. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are vocal about the massive impact this aid has. In the words of an officer with the 148th Artillery Brigade, we can see the impact of the aid every day. Artillery, longer-range multiple-launch rocket systems with various types of ammunition and submunitions, it's affecting the overall battlefield picture. The last thing that the West can do to make Putin sweat doesn't have anything to do directly with Ukraine. It refers to changing the regime in Belarus, Russia's only remaining ally in the region. While Alexander Lukashenko is in power, Putin will continue using Belarus as a starting point for his military operations in the region, potentially advancing against the entirety of Europe. Recently, Putin even moved part of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal to Belarus, suggesting that the first nuclear strikes could be launched from this territory. Defeating Putin while the war is still limited to only Ukraine is the only way to prevent a World War III-like escalation, and taking Lukashenko out of the picture would certainly help achieve that goal. Of course, there's always the question of what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. As of 2024, Russia possesses 5,850 nuclear warheads, the most in the world, which is why a nuclear war is the first thing to come to mind when thinking of a potential escalation. It doesn't help that Putin has been rather cavalier about the potential use of these weapons, leaving the rest of the world in just as much panic as he's currently experiencing. But what do you think? Is there a way to push Putin to the edge without provoking World War III? And if so, what do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? No matter how the war in Ukraine ends, one thing is for sure. Putin will come out of it battered and broken. Reports from August 5, 2024 state the country has lost 579,490 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion. Tens of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and resources have also been sacrificed. Russia's economy has been damaged beyond repair, and most importantly, the carefully constructed image of a resurgent superpower has irrevocably shattered, exposing Russia as a shell of its former self. Given these catastrophic and enduring consequences, it's only natural to wonder, would Russia's President Vladimir Putin have pulled the trigger on that fateful February 24th had he known what was in store for his country? The simple answer is probably no. But these consequences are so deeply humiliating that they practically beg another question. What was Putin thinking in the first place? Again, the answer is simple. He thought he would win, and do so with ease at that. But how could he possibly have been so wrong? This time the answer isn't as straightforward. However, it does revolve around a single thing: unfounded trust. Trust in his institutions, trust in his generals, and trust in himself and his misguided ambitions. Those are the 3 big mistakes Putin made. He trusted all the wrong people. This is the story of how that misplaced trust led Putin to make one miscalculation after another, leaving Russia in ruins forever. Now, before you start feeling too bad for Putin and his blind trust, you should know that he's fully to blame for each and every mistake and miscalculation made in Ukraine. In other words, Putin himself set the stage for his own downfall. His strategic blunders were not mere accidents, they were the inevitable outcome of a deeply flawed approach to governance. To understand the underlying reasons for Putin's three primary mistakes in Ukraine, we must travel back in time, back to the earliest days of Putin's rise to power. Even before becoming president of Russia, Putin made one thing clear: he valued loyalty above all else. In the 1990s, he served as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg under Anatoly Sobchak, his mentor and former professor. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid by a margin of 1.2% in 1996 to Putin's fellow deputy mayor Vladimir Yakovlev, Putin didn't accept a position in the new city administration. His decision to quit was fueled by one thing alone: his loyalty to Sobchak. Supposedly, when he turned down the gig in Yakovlev's office, he did so with his now infamous quote, "It's better to be hanged for loyalty than be rewarded for betrayal." Though praiseworthy on the surface, this unwavering commitment to loyalty set a precedent for his future leadership style, often valuing blind allegiance over competence and merit. So since the very moment he became president in 2000, Putin gradually started to amass power and ensure it stays unchallenged. First, he found a way to remain in power even after officially ceasing to be the president. After serving his second term from 2004 to 2008, Putin engineered a political environment where he could serve as prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev took on the presidency. However, Putin effectively maintained control behind the scenes. He used that control to do what he's always done: discreetly eliminate any institutions that might pose a challenge to his authority. He made sure the media was pro-Putin or off the air. He suppressed dissent and controlled the narrative. As years passed, it became abundantly clear autocratic rule was making a comeback. But this wasn't the only comeback in Russia. The arrival of 2012 saw Putin back in office. After all, the Russian constitution only said that one and the same person may not be elected president of the Russian Federation for more than 2 terms running. It didn't say anything about more than 2 non-consecutive terms. And so, thanks to Article 81, Section 3 of the Russian constitution and some underhanded political maneuvering, Putin returned to power. Well, at least officially. Unofficially, he never left. To make sure he could officially stay in power for years to come, he made, or influenced, a few constitutional reforms. First, the presidential term was increased from 4 to 6 years in 2008, allowing Putin to serve his third term from 2012 to 2018. Then his previous terms were magically erased in 2020, allowing him to run once again for president in 2024, even after serving 2 sets of 2 consecutive terms. It was a mockery of democratic principles. But there's no room for democracy in Putin's regime, only a ruthless consolidation of power and a calculated disregard for the rule of law. Given the political environment Putin built, it shouldn't be surprising that he's had nothing but sycophants and yes-men around him. After all, he has a track record of treating anyone who disagrees with him as an enemy. And we all know the eventual fate of his enemies. They suffer mysterious heart attacks, they fall from windows, their airplane or helicopter crashes, or they're simply shot dead in broad daylight. As a result of this brutal method of silencing dissent, only those willing to flatter Putin and follow him without question can remain in his inner circle. Simply put, Putin has created his own little echo chamber and has never truly received a reality check. This is what reinforces his delusions and leads him to believe he's always right. And this is what's caused his servicemen to feed him inaccurate information that has eventually led to disastrous miscalculations in Ukraine. Just look at it this way. If your life is on the line, you'll tell the dictator what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. Worst of all, this approach doesn't involve carefully collecting intelligence and then weighing what to share and what to withhold. No, it involves playing a guessing game of what the dictator wants to hear. After all, if truth has proven time and again to hold little weight in Russia, why bother seeking it in the first place? Why waste time? Essentially, Putin's approach to governance has stripped his advisors of any incentive to put in the hours and actually come up with sound advice for him. Had his advisors done so in the months before February 24, 2022, the devastating war probably wouldn't still be raging in Ukraine. But Putin's first mistake isn't setting up a system where truth is irrelevant or even detrimental. It's what all autocrats do. His first mistake was trusting the advice from the very institutions he had corrupted and controlled. To be more specific, Putin's first major mistake was trusting Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB for short. The FSB is Russia's primary security agency and the main successor to the Soviet Union's infamous KGB, in which Putin once proudly served as a lieutenant colonel. This agency, eager to please and protect its position within Putin's regime, fed him optimistic and overly favorable reports about the situation in Ukraine. The FSB had two primary tasks: to gauge the West's potential response to another invasion and determine how the Ukrainian population, military, and government would react to a Russian offensive. In both tasks, they failed spectacularly. As far as the West goes, their mistaken assumption was that it would remain divided and passive, fearing economic repercussions. To the FSB's credit, that's precisely what the West did every time Putin previously flexed his muscles. In Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria, the West's response was tepid at best. When he gathered an army of 70,000 or so to invade Georgia in 2008, all he received was a financial slap on the wrist. When he illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, the West's reaction was mainly focused on sanctions that barely scratched Russia's economy. Sure, the United Nations General Assembly also passed Resolution 58262, with 100 countries in favor of protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity, but that's about it. A matching resolution wasn't even adopted by the UN Security Council, as Russia has veto power there. And when he propped up the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the West could only muster vague condemnations and half-hearted measures. Basically, no punishment of consequence came for Putin when he had Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer, poisoned in the UK, or when the Russian hackers intervened in the 2016 US presidential election. In fact, Putin was only getting bolder, while the response from the West was only getting weaker. Germany was even at one point considering starting fresh with Russia, to the point where Angela Merkel, who served as Chancellor of Germany from 2005 to 2021, publicly questioned some of the US sanctions. Of course, there was no tale of friendship and forgiveness behind this skepticism, just a need for Russian gas, which made up 55% of all gas consumed in Germany before the invasion of Ukraine. So the FSB and Putin saw the West as weak and fickle, driven by economic self-interest rather than principled resistance. As such, the Western countries would never seek punitive sanctions that could harm their own economies too. They believed the West wouldn't be able to agree on a simple point, whether Ukraine was worth the fight or not. And in the chaos of indecision and fragmentation, Russia could just swoop in and take Kyiv in a matter of days. But where the FSB operatives failed miserably was recognizing that the West was actually starting to harden its attitude towards Russia. After years of Putin flouting the rule of law boldly and almost proudly, the Western policymakers started coming to terms with a grim reality: Putin was never going to stop. So succumbing to Russia's blackmail and intimidation was slowly ceasing to be an option for the West. In other words, there was never any doubt about how the West would respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Western countries weren't debating whether or not to get involved. They were debating whether Putin was truly foolish enough to go through with such a brazen move. But when he did, he was met with a united Western front. Russia was slapped with unprecedented economic sanctions. Hundreds of Western businesses withdrew from Russia. Millions of the country's assets were frozen. Even new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz froze the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project and sought a new gas supplier elsewhere. Though it took a while, Western countries eventually started delivering financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine. As of February 29, 2024, the US, Germany, and the UK have donated the most as individual nations. The US donated $2.53 billion in humanitarian aid, $21.47 billion in financial aid, and $43.08 billion in military aid. And that was before the $61 billion aid package was passed in April 2024. As for Germany, it sent Ukraine more than $37.24 billion in financial aid, making available much more than just military equipment, and that's not to mention all the aid it indirectly secured for Ukraine by tirelessly campaigning for other Western allies to step up. Finally, the UK has donated $16.3 billion in financial aid, of which $9.91 billion is for military assistance. That's pretty far from leaving Ukraine to its own devices, isn't it? But let's be honest, even if Ukraine was left to fend for itself, its people and soldiers would have fought Russia to the bitter end. This brings us to the second fatally wrong assessment of the FSB. The agency believed that the Russian army would meet little to no resistance in Ukraine. Even worse, there were strong beliefs that the Russian soldiers would be welcomed as liberators, not invaders. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Putin expected to seize Kyiv in a matter of days. Again, these assumptions are somewhat founded on past experiences. After all, Russia annexed Crimea without spilling any blood. It didn't even send in 190,000 troops as it did for the Ukraine invasion, just about 6 helicopters and 3 Ilyushin Il-76 airlifters worth of the so-called Little Green Men, i.e. members of Russian Spetsnaz special forces units with no military insignia. But if the FSB had actually done its job, it would have realized that Ukraine in 2022 was not Crimea in 2014. We aren't talking about a peninsula filled with apathetic or pro-Russian sentiments. We're talking about an independent nation with its own identity, culture, and independence, no matter how hard Russia tried to deny these. Just because some Ukrainians shared Russia's antagonism toward the West didn't make them pro-Russian. The same goes for expressing nostalgia for the Soviet era. According to a poll conducted in April 2014 by the Kyiv International Institute for Sociology, as many as 70% of Ukrainians from the southeastern provinces targeted by Russia were against a unification with Russia. So no, Ukraine didn't welcome the Russian troops with open arms and flowers. It welcomed them with bullets, with fierce resistance, unwavering patriotism, and a determined fight for its sovereignty, a fight that the Russian invaders were utterly unprepared for. Besides misjudging the Ukrainian people and underestimating their resistance, the FSB also underestimated Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. If it was up to Zelensky's predecessors Petro Poroshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, Putin might have just been able to walk in and seize Kyiv. But Zelensky, who the FSB pegged as a weak link and saw as an actor, not a politician, proved to be anything but a pushover. While Zelensky might not be perfect, he certainly rose to the occasion. This democratically elected leader didn't flee the country as the FSB believed he would. Instead, he stayed in Kyiv, often sharing messages of defiance and unity, rallying the Ukrainian people and fortifying their resolve. "We are here, we are in Kyiv, we are defending Ukraine," was one of these messages, a sentiment that the FSB never saw coming. But remember, Putin was the one to set this catastrophic misjudgment in motion. He has made the FSB what it is today, a toxic echo chamber of incompetence. So he got exactly the FSB he deserved and the intelligence he deserved, flawed, delusional, and disastrously misleading. The same goes for the information he received from his high-ranking military officials. This brings us to Putin's second major mistake, trusting his generals, who were no less adept at feeding him false assurances and wishful thinking. From the military perspective, Putin was assured that the invasion of Ukraine would be a walk in the park. After all, that's how the potential war in Ukraine looked on paper. In one corner you had the mighty Russian military, believed to be the second strongest in the world, a vast force equipped with modern weaponry, overwhelming numbers, and a reputation for brute strength. In the other corner, there was Ukraine, a country with a significantly smaller and less well-equipped military, plagued by outdated technology and years of underfunding. Just a comparison of the numbers alone should show why Russia looked a clear winner on paper. In 2021, Ukraine spent $4.7 billion on defense. Russia, on the other hand, spent almost tenfold, $45.8 billion. Ukraine had about 196,000 active duty troops and 900,000 reservists. Russia also had 900,000 soldiers, but they were the active duty ones, while their reserves boasted a staggering 2 million people. When marching into Ukraine, Russia sent about 190,000 troops, almost as many as Ukraine had in total. The situation wasn't any different in the equipment department. Ukraine had 3,309 armored fighting vehicles. Russia had 15,857. Ukraine operated 132 aircraft, Russia with 1,391. Ukraine had no submarines, and Russia owned 49. But as the battle for Ukraine began, it became clear that Putin's generals made two blunders. They overestimated the Russian forces and underestimated the Ukrainian ones. For starters, Ukraine wasn't the only battle Russia was fighting or having a standoff with at the time. There were also the Baltic states, Finland, the US, and NATO in general. So it wasn't like the country could deploy all its available troops and equipment to Ukraine. In contrast, Ukraine's sole focus was Russia, so it came at it in full force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians of all ages mobilized almost instantly, queuing for hours to join their local defense units. As it turned out, the army that Russia saw as weak and disorganized was actually a collection of heroes ready to defend their homeland with unprecedented unity. Fleeing or surrendering was never an option, and yet that's precisely what Putin was told the Ukrainian soldiers would do in a matter of days, if not hours. But the problem wasn't just that the Ukrainian military turned out to be much stronger than anticipated. It was also that the Russian military turned out to be a far cry from the supposed second strongest military in the world. Faced with unexpected resistance and plagued by internal issues, the Russian military lost at least half its professional army in the first 6 months of the war in Ukraine. These numbers included some of the most elite soldiers and officers, as well as advanced weaponry and equipment. It seems that years of relentless propaganda, extravagant military parades, and rosy forecasts from his generals misled Putin into believing his nation had a world-class military capable of engaging and prevailing in any continental conflict. The actual performance of the Russian military on the Ukrainian battlefield painted an entirely different picture. As the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken put it, the Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. Again, to be fair, these realizations came later, even for the most seasoned Western intelligence officers. Although US intelligence correctly estimated that the invasion was going to happen, it initially underestimated the scale of the Ukrainian resistance and the Russian military's inefficiencies. Simply put, US intelligence also believed that Kyiv would collapse swiftly. But the US intelligence officers were mistaken, as was Putin and his collection of sycophants. But even if we take Putin's lapdogs out of the equation, chances are the Russian president would still repeat many of the same mistakes. Why? Because he would let himself be blinded by his misguided beliefs and unfounded ambition. And that was Putin's third major mistake, his overconfidence in his infallibility and his catastrophic overreach. But let's pump the brakes for a second. Putin hasn't gotten where he is by making purely reckless decisions and moves. Before the invasion of Ukraine, he was perceived as a calculating and shrewd strategist, adept at leveraging power and exploiting weaknesses. So what led him down such a disastrous path this time? The answer to this question is multifaceted. First of all, it appears that Putin truly believed that Ukraine was Russian territory, and Ukrainians and Russians were one people, forcefully separated by the fall of the Soviet Union. He saw the separation between Russia and Ukraine as a historical injustice, and he was hell-bent on correcting this injustice at all costs. Worst of all, he has seemingly stuck to his conviction, as even after almost 2 years of conflict, he argued that Russia held a historic claim to Ukraine in his February 2024 interview with the former Fox News host Tucker Carlson. He also believed in his heart of hearts that the West was the true architect of this supposed division. To justify his actions, Putin propagated the idea that NATO's alleged expansion into Eastern Europe was the catalyst for his aggressive stance, blaming the West for forcing his hand and exacerbating the situation. In his eyes, he had no other option but to invade Ukraine or launch a special military operation as he saw it. Otherwise, Ukraine would have applied for NATO membership, as encouraged by the US, and the rest of Russia's European neighbors were likely to follow suit. Since he saw NATO's expansion as an existential threat to Russia, he had to act to ensure the survival and security of the Russian state and people and prevent a strategic encirclement. Paradoxically, it's precisely Putin's actions that ended up pushing Finland and Sweden, traditionally neutral countries, to join NATO on April 4, 2023 and March 7, 2024 respectively. So in trying to secure Russia's sphere of influence, Putin's invasion of Ukraine only accelerated the very outcomes he sought to avoid. Of course, many Western commentators see pointing the finger at NATO expansion as nothing but an excuse for his atrocious actions. In reality, Putin was fueled by a desire to restore Russia's superpower status and secure his legacy. That's the relentless ambition that blinded him to the realities staring him right in the face. To achieve these goals, Putin was seemingly ready to fight the entire West, not just Ukraine. He wanted to be revered in history books as the man who succeeded in restoring Russia's grandeur, defying Western dominance, and rewriting the global order. As Professor Brian Taylor, a Russian politics expert, put it, Putin saw himself as a great historic Russian leader restoring Russian lands. Throw his overwhelming public support and lack of blowback into the mix, and it becomes clear why Putin was so audacious. He was intoxicated by the belief that he was on the verge of a historic triumph. And let's remember, Russian success in Ukraine seemed more than plausible to everyone, not just Putin, so he wasn't entirely off base. He also seemed to believe that the timing for the invasion was just right. Zelensky's approval rating might have soared after the Russian invasion, but in 2021 it hit a record low. Only 12% of Ukrainians strongly approved of Zelensky's actions, which led Putin to believe the Ukrainian elite would likely unite against their president. In the same year, the Biden administration decided to withdraw the US troops from Afghanistan, an event that severely impacted global perceptions of American resolve and stability. Germany and the UK also got new leaders, as Olaf Scholz succeeded Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany, and Liz Truss briefly replaced Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK back in September 2022. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron was under a lot of pressure due to domestic issues and a highly contentious presidential election. In all this chaos, Putin saw his chance to strike and avoid facing a united Western front. But just like the FSB, he was wrong. Due to his isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic and his rumored illness, Putin wasn't able to verify most of his beliefs and the FSB's claims. He also failed to see how weak his military truly was. Before the pandemic, he would often oversee military exercises and visit various facilities. He would travel often, engaging directly with military leaders and receiving first-hand updates on operational readiness. But as the pandemic took hold, his mobility was restricted and his reliance on remote briefings and filtered reports grew. This isolation eroded his grasp on reality and convinced him that he was the savior that Russia had yearned for ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. With the rumors of his long-term and seemingly terminal illness, Putin might have wanted to secure his legacy before his time ran out. Based on all these misguided beliefs, he made his gravest mistake. he launched a terribly miscalculated war in Ukraine. All of Putin's three major mistakes created the perfect storm that managed to reshape the global order, but not in the way that Putin had anticipated. The very institutions, tactics, and beliefs that kept him in power for over 20 years were now his undoing. But what do you think? Which of Putin's mistakes was the gravest, and which misguided belief cost him the most? Russia's forces should have been overwhelming. By December 2021, it had amassed around 100,000 troops around Ukraine, surrounding the country on three sides. When Russia finally entered Ukraine in February 2022, it had assembled 83 battalion tactical groups, with the initial incursion seeing up to 200,000 soldiers invade in what was supposed to be a smash-and-grab exercise. Their goal was simple: secure Kyiv in a matter of weeks so Russian President Vladimir Putin could depose Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and claim Ukraine as part of Russia. Only, that's not what happened. Facing seemingly insurmountable odds, the valiant Ukrainian troops pushed Russia's initial advance back. And since February 2022, those soldiers have fought valiantly, slowing Russia's progress to a crawl, retaking key cities like Kharkiv, and as of August 6, 2024, entering Russian territory to conduct an invasion of their own. Russia has been outsmarted at every turn, outmaneuvered regularly by a Ukrainian military at dwarfs both in terms of sheer manpower and the amount of equipment that it has at its disposal. And now Ukraine is no longer holding the line while trying to defend itself, it's overseeing the crumbling of the Russian military that will ultimately see Putin and his army collapse under the very type of pressure he tried to exert on Ukraine. That's the opinion of retired US General David Petraeus. But why does Petraeus believe that Russia's military is on the verge of crumbling? This video will answer that question using interview quotes from the general himself, along with evidence to support the claims he makes. But before answering that question, we need to answer another. Who is David Petraeus? Born in November 1952, Petraeus is a US Army general who was appointed to lead the multinational forces former President George W. Bush amassed to serve in Iraq in 2007. Petraeus is also the former Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, or CENTCOM, a role in which he served between 2008 and 2010. As well as a former director of the CIA and one of the commanders who led the US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. He has received a slew of honors for his service, including the Distinguished Service Medal, 4 Legion of Merit Awards, a pair of Defense Superior Service Medals, and a Bronze Star with a V device, which is given to those who display great valor. In other words, he's a military expert who has seen and done it all. So when he talks about the state of Putin's military, it's wise to listen to what he has to say. That brings us to August 18, 2024. On that date, interview footage emerged of Petraeus speaking about the strategic brilliance Ukraine has displayed during its war with Russia, and how that brilliance has allowed Ukraine to reshape the entire war. It's taken the war out of Putin's control, grasping the momentum and putting Putin in a position where he has to watch the slow collapse of a military that many believed to be one of the world's strongest before February 2022. Petraeus starts with a brief analysis of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. They did achieve enormous surprise with the Russians. They managed to assemble elements of 4 brigades, not just infantry and armor, but also artillery, air defenses, electronic warfare, and so forth. So it's a real combined arms effort with logistics. Petraeus refers, of course, to Ukraine's initial invasion of Kursk. Russia attempted to downplay that invasion, which began on August 6, 2024, claiming that it had ended what it dubbed a small incursion. It hadn't. The initial group of 300 Ukrainians that's believed to have crossed the border on that date has since been supplemented with several thousand more, with Ukraine also claiming to control 482 square miles of Kursk. That includes over 90 settlements, according to Zelensky, with the success coming as a result of the combined arms effort that Petraeus highlights. The retired general also highlights one of the key mistakes Putin made that enabled the Kursk invasion in the first place, pointing out that the Russian defenses on the border were not very substantial. Again, that's been backed up by later reports, which were mostly made up of recent conscripts, many of whom were aged between 18 and 20. An August 30th report in the Moscow Times notes that the deaths and surrenders of these conscripts highlighted a hollow civic identity within Russia, while adding that the loss of those conscripts will resonate within Russian society. That's bad enough for Putin. However, the Moscow Times also notes that the use of conscripts in such a vital area shows that the Russian army has degraded to the point where it cannot fight a fully fledged war with professional soldiers. In other words, Russia has been exposed. When Petraeus says that the border defenses were not very substantial, he's actually hinting at the fact that Russia's military has already collapsed to such a point that it's relying on inexperienced and poorly trained conscripts to defend its own territory. Back to Petraeus, he also reveals what Ukraine has already gained from the Kursk invasion. They're pushing the Russians out. From this, they're gaining an enormous morale boost. They're collecting Russian prisoners for later exchange for Ukrainian prisoners held by Russia. They have also cut a very important rail line that Russia used to send logistics and troops from, say, the Moscow region down to the southeastern part of Ukraine. There's a fair amount to unpack here. On the subject of morale, it's clear that the Kursk invasion has had a positive effect. Speaking to Reuters on August 21st, 51-year-old Kyiv resident Ola Pavlovska said, "This was a very brave and important step for keeping up morale in society." Her words are echoed by many in Kyiv, as well as soldiers who were involved in the invasion. The Kursk invasion isn't a simple act of Ukraine taking Russian territory. It's a demonstration, one that shows Ukraine is now fighting the war on its own terms, rather than Russia's. And again, the fact that the invasion was successful showcases the weaknesses of Russia in key areas. It may be pouring hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Ukraine, but it's doing so while its internal defenses crumble. As for prisoners, Ukraine now has plenty of those. On August 27th, Kyiv's chief commander, Alexander Syrsky, claimed that Ukraine had captured a staggering 594 prisoners of war, or POWs, in just 21 days, meaning prisoners are being taken at a rate of around 28 per day. "We managed to increase our exchange fund," Syrsky said, which reinforces Petraeus' comments that Ukraine now has more leverage to get back some of its lost troops as a result of Kursk. Even in these early comments from Petraeus, we see evidence that Russia's military is crumbling. It barely put up a defense against Ukraine's incursion, with those defending being recent conscripts rather than experienced Russian soldiers. And it's losing men to surrender at an alarming rate. Add to this actions like the crippling of the rail line Petraeus mentions, and you see how Ukraine is also attempting to cut the Russians that are in its country off from their own country. The loss of that line means fewer troops and less equipment entering Ukraine from the north, setting the stage for further Russian crumbling later on. The situation is so bad, claims Petraeus, that Russia has been forced to scramble. They're having to pull forces from the southern area to react to this. It's obvious that their border forces, the irregular territorial forces, and the National Guard have been incapable of standing up to the Ukrainians. Again, the evidence backs him up. In the same Politico piece in which Syrsky claimed Ukraine had taken almost 600 prisoners, Ukraine's leading general also highlighted how many soldiers Russia has been forced to send to Kursk. He says that the Kremlin has sent some 30,000 soldiers from other directions to Kursk, and their number is growing. That may seem like a logical response from Moscow, and it is, but it's also a response that shows weakness in the Russian military. If Putin's forces were as strong as he would like the rest of the world to believe, he wouldn't need to divert soldiers from key locations in Ukraine to defend Kursk. He'd simply send some from Moscow or elsewhere in Russian territory. But he's having to weaken his attack in Ukraine so he can defend Russian territory, which reinforces Petraeus' point that Russia's internal defenses simply aren't strong enough. We may not be seeing the collapse of the Russian military in terms of the sheer number of soldiers, but the fact that 30,000 troops have been moved from Ukraine suggests that there's a major skill problem in Russia's military. Putin doesn't feel he can rely on the soldiers he has in Russia to do the job, which once again means Ukraine has succeeded in exposing Russia's frailty. Petraeus then switches focus to consider the broader implications of the Kursk invasion on the Ukraine war, particularly when it comes to Russia's attempts to taking more territory in the Donetsk region. "I think they're trying to continue their offensive in the southeastern area, and Donetsk in particular, and not interfere with that. And that does, to be fair, continue to achieve incremental gains against the Ukrainian forces," he says. He's not wrong. Though Putin has been forced to divert troops away from some of Russia's offensives, it's still slowly gaining ground in Donetsk and other regions. The Institute for the Study of War highlighted this in late August, with its interactive maps showing that Russia has made some significant advances in Pokrovsk, which is a city in Donetsk that serves as a key logistical hub for Ukraine. As of August 28th, Russia has entered Memrik, which lies 18 miles from Pokrovsk, and it's slowly continuing to advance. Does that mean Ukraine's effort to divert Russian troops has failed? Not necessarily. Petraeus notes that this continued focus on Donetsk belies Putin's inability to create a proper response to the situation in Kursk. So far, not a particularly coherent response yet, the retired general says when talking about Putin's response. What the organizational architecture of this will eventually be is not yet clear to the observers out there. Eventually, they have to really push their forces against this to get the Ukrainians out of Russian territory. Putin knows this. His problem is that he can't come up with a clear plan that details the logistics of how Russia will achieve this and where the combat power will come from. The redeployment of 30,000 soldiers to Kursk may make it seem like Russia is mounting a powerful response, but that high number is deceiving. Putin has given Ukraine plenty of time to mount defenses, as well as cut off access to the regions it's already taken. It's already destroyed 2 bridges into Kursk, allowing it to create a buffer zone within Russian territory through which those 30,000 soldiers will need to navigate. And without the bridges that they would rely upon to get into Kursk, those soldiers are going to be far less effective than their numbers indicate. It again shows how relatively inadequate these Russian forces inside Russia actually are, Petraeus claims. Russia is sending all of its mainline forces into the offensive in the southeast and holding the line in the south. Again, these comments point to a collapse of the Russian military on its soil. Diverting 30,000 troops sounds impressive until you realize that this diversion will be less effective because of the time it's taken for Putin to create that response. It smacks of a leader dealing in desperation. He has been forced to recognize that Russia's internal forces can't stand up to a relatively small contingent of invading Ukrainians. Now he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he's mostly choosing to continue the Russian offensive in southeastern Ukraine. That decision may come back to bite him, as it opens the door for Ukraine to continue making gains in Kursk, all while fighting off the inexperienced and scattered troops that Putin is sending to retake the territory. That indecision could also mean that Russia is no longer in a position to end the Ukraine war on its own terms. It also shows that Ukraine is capable of doing something that the increasingly weakening Russian forces can't do: conduct complicated advances. Throughout the war, we've seen the same pattern in Putin's strategy. Rather than relying on the combined might of his aerial and ground forces to conduct cooperative strikes against Ukrainian positions, he has simply bombarded these positions with artillery while sending soldier after soldier into them. Putin has created a meat grinder. We saw this during the Battle of Bakhmut, which lasted a year and at one point saw Russia losing around 820 soldiers per day. Its loss tally by the end of the battle was around 30,000, a heavy price to pay for taking a fairly small city of just 16.1 square miles. With the Kursk invasion, Ukraine has taken well over 20 times that amount of territory in less than a month, with barely any losses being recorded on its side. Part of the reason for that comes down to what Petraeus mentioned regarding Russia using recently assigned conscripts to guard its borders. However, Global Guardian intelligence analyst Joe Chaffetz says that there's another reason. If nothing else, Kyiv's foray into Kursk has demonstrated that Ukrainian forces are capable of complicated mechanized advances, he told USA Today. Continuing to use that strategy could allow Ukraine to replicate the Kursk success inside Russia, enabling it to take more territory. And in doing so, Ukraine could even thwart Putin's strategy of making incremental and irreversible advances. The meat grinder approach would have to end, and Putin would be forced to focus on more complex tactics. Given that Russia has already lost around 613,500 soldiers as of producing this video, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and is set to lose many more, that need to match Ukraine's complex tactics creates a problem. Russia's military may not have the expertise needed, especially after losing so many combat veterans. So its collapse may come, partially, as a result of ineptitude and inexperience, rather than simply no longer having the manpower. Petraeus' comments ended with his pointing out how inadequate Russia's forces are. That alone could be taken as a sign of impending collapse of the Russian military. However, there are other issues at play. Take the psychological impact this invasion could have on Russia and its military as an example. Before the war in Ukraine began, Russia was feared the world over as having one of the world's strongest militaries. This was an image that Putin was more than happy to play up, not least because it fed into the image of the strongman, authoritarian leader that's enabled him to hold on to power in Russia for over 20 years. However, even before the Kursk invasion, Russia's efforts in Ukraine had revealed it to be something of a paper tiger. Yes, it can withstand a lot of punishment, but each of its attacks leads to severe losses, with those lost soldiers being replaced by contracted mercenaries or poorly trained conscripts. Now, those paper tiger accusations have intensified given how easily Ukraine entered Kursk. Beyond having a strong impact on Ukrainian morale, that incursion has to be damaging to Russia's military and, in particular, how Putin's people view his ability to defend his countrymen. The early signs of a decline in confidence are already coming in the wake of the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC in Canada, a Ukrainian soldier who wished only to be identified by his codename of Wolverine spoke about his experiences with Russians in Kursk following his taking part in the invasion. In addition to pointing out how good the capture of Russian territory was for Ukrainian morale, Wolverine noted that many of the Russian soldiers and people he came across seemed disillusioned. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government, Wolverine told CBC. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions. In other words, Putin started treating Kursk like a war zone without really thinking about its people. Granted, the evacuation orders eventually came, with around 200,000 of the oblast's residents now having been moved on, but those early days of the Kursk invasion revealed a lot to the people living in the region. They showed that Putin had underestimated his Ukrainian foe and that he didn't have a plan in place to help his people if they were ever in danger. Earlier, we spoke about Putin's strongman image and how it's essential to the leadership of his people and military. That image relies on Putin being able to demonstrate that he can lead Russia to greater things and that, crucially, he can protect Russia from any external threat. The Kursk invasion shook that belief to the point where many Russians will now be doubting Putin's leadership. What does that have to do with Petraeus' comments about the Russian military crumbling? Lowering opinions of Putin damaged a collective Russian morale that was already a problem before the Kursk invasion. In March 2014, the Forum for Ukrainian Studies published a piece in which it noted that one of Putin's main military strategies appears to be to lower Ukrainian morale via the maximization of Russia's material and manpower advantages. The idea is to use constant pressure to bear down on Ukraine. Only now the situation has been flipped. Ukraine's soldiers are in Russia. Their morale is higher than it's been for a long time. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers have been struggling with morale crises since the Ukraine war turned into a conflict of attrition. Putin has been recruiting people who never wanted to be in the war in the first place. Desertions and post-abandonments are rife, with over 18,000 Russian troops abandoning the country's southern military district in April 2024 alone. Pressure is now being placed on Putin and his military. Morale is key in war. It affects a soldier's ability to engage in combat operations, in addition to affecting commanders and their ability to organize their troops. How can you coordinate an attack or a defense when you're having to deal with soldiers deserting daily? By failing to stop the Kursk invasion and then being slow to respond to it, Putin has placed even greater strain on a collective Russian military morale that was already close to the breaking point. So Russia's military crumbling may end up being less a direct result of it being further stretched by the Ukrainian advance and more a result of its soldiers simply losing their appetite for a fight that was never meant to last this long in the first place. Psychologically, Russia's military can no longer view itself as one of the world's strongest. It's failed to take Ukraine after 2.5 years of trying. Any advances it makes in Ukraine are slow and come at the cost of thousands of lives. And now Russian civilians are having to deal with the war being brought to their doorstep. Add all of this to the points Petraeus made about Ukraine using its troops in Russia to cut off vital supply lines and the region itself, and you have a collection of issues that ruin the Russian psyche. Putin can no longer position himself as the strongman defender of Russia. And with the loss of that positioning may come the loss of support of the Russian military, along with the country's people and any of Russia's elite who may come sniffing around Putin's seat of power. Let's come back to Petraeus' comments about Russian military inadequacy. The general made those comments in the context of Russia's internal defenses, pointing out that the use of inexperienced conscripts as border guards and defensive lines within Russia played a large part in Ukraine's Kursk successes. Those inexperienced soldiers couldn't stand up to the far more combat-hardened Ukrainians they came up against, leading to the massive volume of surrenders we're seeing during this incursion. That inadequacy is the result of a larger problem in Russia's military that's causing it to crumble from the inside: terrible training. In May 2023, Newsweek reported on a British intelligence assessment which said that Russia's ground forces in Ukraine mostly consisted of poorly trained, mobilized reservists who were becoming increasingly reliant on antiquated equipment. The situation was so bad, according to the report, that Russia's combined grouping of forces, which numbered 200,000 at the time, was only capable of completing very simple infantry-based operations. We've seen that throughout the war. Every Russian gain has come as a result of Putin throwing people at a Ukrainian position, sacrificing thousands in the process, while he fails to bring Russia's superior aerial might to bear. Joint operations are limited and usually reduced to launching bombs and artillery at a position, followed up by soldiers, which is an antiquated tactic. CNA points out that these training problems have long existed in Russia's military. It says these issues exist for many reasons, ranging from procedural rigidity and, as the British pointed out, a lack of access to proper equipment. However, it also notes a lack of standardization, a result, it says, of an emphasis on in-house training within units. In other words, much of a Russian soldier's training takes place once they have already been deployed. That's fine in a peaceful scenario, as the new soldier has time to learn the ropes, but when Russia is in an active war, this focus on in-unit training inevitably leads to barely trained conscripts being put into positions they're nowhere near ready enough to handle. That's what happened in Kursk. But it's happening in Ukraine as well, with this poor training playing a huge role in Russia experiencing as many losses as it has. Think about what this means for Russia's military in the future. Putin has already lost over 600,000 soldiers if Ukraine's Ministry of Finance has accurate figures, which likely means he's already lost most of the experienced troops he initially sent into Ukraine. Those experienced soldiers are being followed up by poorly trained infantry who don't have the time to learn the ropes in the traditional Russian way, resulting in even more losses. Internally, Russia is defending itself with conscripts as young as 19 years old who have no chance of contending with a Ukraine that's capable of far more complex combat operations. Perhaps that inexperience is part of the reason why the coherent Russian response to the Kursk incursion Petraeus mentions hasn't come yet. Putin can't trust his poorly trained soldiers to put up an adequate defense. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin was getting away with this poor training. Russia faced no threat on its soil, so Putin could conscript, contract, and cajole people into being fed into the Ukraine war meat grinder because his tactic was to destroy morale with a constant flood of manpower. Now the situation is different. Russia is having to defend itself while it attacks, and as Petraeus points out, we're already seeing the signs of a Russian collapse. Mass surrenders in the face of Ukrainian invaders, the pushing of troops from other locations into Russia to mount a response weakened the Russian front line elsewhere. Combine this stretching of manpower with prominent training issues and quickly declining Russian morale, and you have all of the ingredients of an incoming military collapse. That collapse may come as a result of Ukraine's pressure in Kursk. It may even come because Putin's people no longer trust him to be the strong man they need to defend them. But make no mistake about it, the collapse is coming. At least that's according to General Petraeus. But what do you think about the state of Russia's military today, and what the future may hold for Putin's forces? Is talk about a collapse a touch ambitious, or is Russia heading toward a fall? 1,000 days. That's how long Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has dragged on. 1,000 days into a war that was supposed to last just 3, Russia finds itself in freefall. Ukraine, against all odds, has turned the tide, not just holding the line, but grinding Russia's military into dust. Staggering troop losses, shattered equipment, and crumbling morale paint a grim picture for the Kremlin. Putin's grand gamble has backfired spectacularly, and the cracks in his war machine are now impossible to ignore. But what sealed Russia's fate? The answer lies in a daring moment that reshaped the battlefield: the Kursk incursion. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast, catching Moscow completely off guard. Ukrainian forces quickly breached Russian defenses, capturing dozens of square miles of Russian territory within the first few days. By the end of the first week, Ukraine had secured around 386 square miles of land, and Russian authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it took Ukrainian troops only a week to show the world just how fragile Russia's position truly is. Naturally, for Russia, this incursion was a humiliating blow. After all, we aren't talking about a border skirmish, we're talking about a full-scale breach into Russian territory. A breach that awarded Putin a not-so-flattering title: the first Russian leader in modern history to have foreign troops on Russian soil. However, the Ukrainian troops haven't been just holding ground, they've been inflicting serious damage on Russia's military infrastructure. Ukrainian artillery and drones have been hammering Russian positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles, tanks, and equipment. But that's not even the worst part. Thousands of Russian soldiers have also been sent to an early grave, with each day claiming more of the country's already strained forces. To put it simply, it's a slaughter for Russia. A slaughter that shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. The deadliest days for Russian troops are no longer early 2022 when the invasion first began. They're now in November 2024, as the battlefield becomes more unforgiving with every passing day. But words alone don't do justice to the scale of these losses. The numbers tell the true story of Russia's unraveling. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost 725,740 troops from February 24, 2022 to November 20, 2024. That's nearly 750,000 lives shattered in less than 3 years, and the toll keeps rising. As of November 20th, the deadliest day for Russian troops was November 11th, when they lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, or 1,950 to be precise. To put this into perspective, that's almost as many military personnel the United States lost during 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Yes, you heard that right. Between October 7, 2001 and August 30, 2021, the US suffered a total of 2,324 combat deaths. Russia nearly matched this number in casualties in just 24 hours. The scale of this bloodshed truly defies comprehension. But November 11th was no isolated incident. The record that was broken that day was set the day before. on November 10th, which was also reported as Russia's deadliest day since the beginning of the invasion, with 1,770 losses. The previous record, 1,740 Russian losses, was set on May 13th, mere days after Russia launched an offensive operation in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. But this doesn't mean that the early days of November were merciful for Russia. On November 8th, the country lost 1,660 troops. On November 4th, it was 1,260. November 1st claimed 1,270. You get the picture. October, previously the deadliest month for Russian forces, recorded 41,980 casualties, an average of roughly 1,350 per day. Yet November is shaping up to surpass even that grim milestone, with the last few days in November recording losses well over 1,500 a day. November 19th, 1,690. November 18th, 1,610. November 17th, 1,560. November 16th, 1,640. November 15th, 1,650. November 14th, 1,520. November 13th, 1,690. November 12th, 1,770. This devastation has led many to label what's unfolding in Kursk as nothing short of a massacre. Videos circulating online show hundreds of Russian vehicles obliterated, some with troops still inside, highlighting the utter futility of Moscow's repeated assaults. Of course, Russia wouldn't be Russia if it didn't try to spin things around. Russian soldiers have also been posting videos and photos of their battleground successes in Kursk. One such instance involves a Russian soldier proudly posing next to a Ukrainian Leopard 2 tank that his unit supposedly hit and captured. Given that Leopard 2 tanks are highly advanced and relatively scarce in Ukraine's arsenal, this was quite the achievement, right? Well, not quite. Upon closer inspection, this tank turned out to be nothing more than a decoy. A well-crafted decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. This bizarre display of desperation perfectly sums up the contrast between Russia's propaganda and the reality on the ground. This contrast has become so significant that Russian commanders have reportedly been arrested for exaggerating battlefield gains. According to recent reports, these arrests stem from Moscow's growing frustration with the gap between the glowing victories portrayed in state media and the catastrophic losses being suffered in Kursk. In a shocking turn of events, several mid-level and senior officers were accused of fabricating reports to appease higher-ups, overstating territorial gains and inflating Ukrainian losses. The goal of these false claims was to shield the commanders from criticism and disciplinary actions. However, they only managed to fuel the Kremlin's delusions about the state of the war. Yet another major miscalculation. So now, with Kursk turning into a disaster of unprecedented scale, the Kremlin's crackdown on its own commanders showcases the chaos and paranoia within Russia's military leadership. However, the fact that Russian commanders felt compelled to do this in the first place exposes another thing. The Russian chain of command is completely fractured. But as the Kursk debacle continues, no amount of doctor reports or arrests can mask the truth of Russia's mounting failures. But it's not just manpower that's being bled dry. Russia's equipment is also taking a brutal beating. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as of November 20th, Russia has lost an astounding 9,390 tanks, 19,119 armored vehicles, and 20,681 artillery systems. These losses also extend to Russia's aerial and naval fleet, with 369 airplanes, 329 helicopters, and 28 ships and boats destroyed. Even drones, a crucial tool for modern warfare, haven't escaped unscathed. Over 19,202 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles have been taken out of action so far. November alone has added significantly to these staggering totals. In just one day, November 19th, Ukrainian forces reportedly took out 8 tanks, 27 armored personnel vehicles, 49 artillery systems, and 91 drones. And remember the deadliest day for the Russians, November 11th? Well, that single day claimed 23 tanks and 81 armored personnel vehicles. November added a couple more dismal milestones to Russia's depressing track record. As of November 20th, Russia has officially lost over 1,000 anti-aircraft systems. While Russia passed 4 digits in this department, it's quickly approaching a devastating 5-digit number in total. A total of 29,648 vehicles and fuel tanks have been lost so far, with November 19th adding another 100 to the tally. It's only a matter of time before Russia's vehicle losses surpass the mind-blowing 30,000 mark. Each new day seems to bring another chapter of devastation to Moscow's war effort, and the worst part is that Russia cannot possibly replace these vital resources at the pace required. Now, you might wonder, isn't Russia's economy on a war footing? With all the resources pouring into the defense industry, How is it possible that it can't keep up? Well, the answer is simple. The losses are just too big. Russia's production lines, stretched to their limits, simply can't match the ferocious pace of destruction. Take large-caliber cannon barrels, for instance. According to Oryx, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website that records documented equipment losses, Russia loses over 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels per month. However, Russia's 2 rotary forges, critical for producing these components, can churn out only 20 barrels monthly. That's a replacement rate of less than 7%. A catastrophic mismatch. Worse still, Russia can't expand its production capacity because the skills and equipment required are controlled by specialist firms abroad, such as Austria's GFM, and given the sanctions, the prospect of acquiring any necessary parts is close to zero. Fighting vehicles tell a similar story. Since the war began, Russia has lost roughly 155 infantry fighting vehicles, according to Oryx. Russian defense manufacturers can produce about 200 per year, or approximately 17 per month, which means they have the capacity to replenish these losses in less than a year. However, sustaining this level of production while also dealing with other categories of equipment losses and maintaining combat operations stretches Russian industry to its limits. Even with the older models scavenged from Soviet-era stockpiles, these reserves won't last indefinitely, raising questions about Russia's ability to keep up over the long term. Russia's artillery production has reportedly tripled to an annual rate of 3 million shells, which sounds impressive. Well, that is until you consider its consumption rate. While Russia is no longer firing the 12 million rounds expended in 2022, estimates suggest its current usage still far outstrips production. This has forced Moscow to rely heavily on imports, such as North Korean shells, which now make up nearly 50% of the artillery used in Ukraine. But shells aren't the only thing coming from North Korea. Beyond artillery, North Korea has provided long-range rocket and artillery systems, including 50 domestically produced 170mm M1989 self-propelled howitzers and 20 upgraded 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems. These contributions mark a deepening military partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, one that shows just how destroyed Russia's defense capabilities are. However, North Korean contributions to the equipment department weren't the most controversial. North Korean troops have arrived in Russia too. As of early November, Pyongyang has deployed around 11,000 soldiers to bolster Russia's efforts in the Kursk Oblast. At the same time, reports suggest that this number could increase in the coming weeks. Divided into assault and support units, these North Korean forces are now integral to Russia's strategy in the region. Yet these troops face significant vulnerabilities. They're poorly trained and equipped, lack battle experience, and don't even understand the language spoken around them. That's why many military experts have labeled them as nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russians. Of course, their involvement speaks volumes about the sheer scale of Moscow's manpower losses. It's obvious that Putin is desperately trying to plug the gaps, as Russia's domestic recruitment and conscription efforts are failing to sustain the war. This makes the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea far from the triumph Putin's propagandists might claim. No, this partnership reeks of desperation. Faced with battlefield attrition rates it can't match and an economy teetering under the weight of war, Moscow has turned to one of the few nations willing to defy sanctions openly. Speaking of Russia's economy, it also has "finished" written all over it, just like Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Sure, on paper this economy might look solid. Russia's gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. Unemployment has hit a historic low of 2.4% and wages have skyrocketed. But this rosy picture hides severe structural problems, driven by the so-called military Keynesianism, an unsustainable, war-fueled economic boost. The defense industry alone has absorbed 500,000 workers, while the armed forces require 30,000 fresh recruits each month to replace casualties. The labor market is so strained that defense firms have had to increase wages five-fold, pushing inflation to 8.68% as of October. These increased wages might attract workers, but they still come at a steep cost. Other sectors, particularly those vital to the civilian economy, are suffering from acute labor shortages. Meanwhile, Moscow's lavish military bonuses have created a financial black hole that the civilian economy simply can't fill. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin has resorted to one of its most cynical moves yet, slashing compensation for wounded soldiers. In a November 13th decree signed by Putin, Russia introduced a sliding scale for injury payouts, cutting what was once a flat payment of roughly $30,000 for any injury to a drastically reduced amount based on the severity of the wounds. Under the new system, only soldiers with the most catastrophic injuries, classified as Section 1 and including severe spinal damage, brain trauma, or life-threatening organ damage, will receive the full $30,000 or 3 million rubles. For less severe but still debilitating injuries such as concussions or gunshot wounds not affecting organs, the payout drops to 1 million rubles or $10,000. And for truly minor injuries, soldiers will receive a paltry 100,000 rubles or roughly $1,000, barely enough to cover basic medical treatment. This cost-cutting measure is a flagrant betrayal of the soldiers who have already paid an immense price for Putin's war. Soldiers suffering from fractures or other injuries that may have long-lasting impacts on their lives are now treated as though their suffering doesn't matter. What was once a gesture of recognition for the hardships of war is now reduced to a cold, calculated formula. But the real sting comes when you consider the financial realities in Russia. With the rising inflation rate of 8% to 8.68%, even the 100,000 rubles for minor injuries will quickly lose their value. This means that the soldiers won't even be taken care of in the short term, let alone in the long run. For many, this is a painful reminder that they are seen as nothing more than expendable resources. However, for Russia, this miserly move was the only viable option, as the war's costs spiral out of control. A 2024 analysis estimated that casualty payouts alone could amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $26 billion. That's roughly 6% of the entire national budget. Faced with this financial hemorrhaging, Moscow is choosing to save rubles at the expense of the very people it sent to fight its war. But it gets worse. While the Kremlin trims compensation for injured troops, it continues to pour money into military bonuses. Lavish signing bonuses are swallowing resources that could otherwise be used to support those injured in service. Basically, Putin is sending a clear message to his people. You'll be paid handsomely to join, but once you leave, you're on your own. That's if you even get to leave. With this in mind, it's no wonder that morale has hit an all-time low among the Russian ranks. But unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't care. He's reportedly ordered the retake of Kursk at all costs. There's even a deadline for recapturing full control over the region, February 1, 2025. That's not even 2 weeks after the newly re-elected US President Donald Trump is set to be sworn into office. While the deadline was reportedly set up before Trump was re-elected, we can't help but wonder about the peculiar timing. With no regard for the lives of his soldiers, Putin is launching his forces forward with the same reckless abandon as at the start of the war. Column after column of Russian vehicles are pushing forward, charging headfirst into Ukraine's prepared defensive positions, despite the significant losses and strategic setbacks. So why the rush? Well, Putin is clearly trying to grab as much negotiating leverage as possible ahead of any potential diplomatic overture to the new US president. By regaining this territory, he will be able to present a victory of sorts to Trump, or at least a strong negotiating position to secure a deal that could be seen as a win for Moscow. But as you've already heard in this video, this all-out push isn't exactly going according to plan. And now, while President Joe Biden is still in office, the US has thrown a major wrench into Russia's plans. He's given Ukraine an all-clear to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. This decision marks a monumental shift in the dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Biden's move, taken on November 17th, followed months of Ukrainian pleas for more potent weapons to strike Russian infrastructure and military targets beyond the front lines. At first, the US resisted providing such weapons for fear of escalating the conflict. However, Moscow's provocative actions, especially the deployment of North Korean soldiers among the 50,000 troops in Kursk, finally prompted a change in Washington's stance. The immediate impact of this policy change was felt just 2 days later, on November 19th, when Ukrainian forces reportedly launched an ATACMS missile against a key Russian munitions storage facility in Karachev, Bryansk Oblast. This attack marked the first time that the US-supplied long-range missiles were used on Russian soil. The target, a vital arsenal of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate, was reportedly destroyed in a dramatic explosion that sent fireballs soaring into the sky. Residents even captured the moment on video, showing the scale of the blast that rocked the region. Ukrainian officials confirmed that the munitions stored at this facility included artillery ammunition and anti-aircraft missiles, which are critical supplies for Russia's ongoing offensive. But why is this strike seen as a turning point in the war? Well, the ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, allows Ukraine to target high-value Russian assets far from the front lines. The weapon's precision and capability to strike so deep within Russian territory will undoubtedly put immense pressure on Moscow's military infrastructure. However, it's important to note that this isn't just about military targets. It's about crippling Russia's ability to resupply its forces and sustain operations across multiple fronts. And this strike is just the beginning. The US decision has allowed Ukraine to incorporate long-range capabilities from other NATO allies, including France and the UK, into its arsenal. These nations are now preparing to send their own long-range missiles to Ukraine, which notably include the Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of 310 miles. These missiles are designed to be launched from fighter jets, further increasing the diversity and reach of Ukraine's strikes within Russian territory. Other NATO allies are likely to follow suit. This means that Russia, which had become accustomed to operating with relative impunity on its own soil, will now be vulnerable to direct attacks that can cripple its logistics, command centers, and military resources. For Putin, this represents a nightmare scenario, a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one within his own borders. Moscow's response to this new reality has been predictably hostile. Russian officials, including Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov, have described the US decision as a dangerous escalation and a new phase of direct US involvement in the conflict. Peskov even warned that this would lead to greater tension between Russia and the West. As for Putin, he did what he does best: resort to the good old nuclear saber-rattling. This time, he dramatically lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of nuclear weapons only in case of a nuclear attack or an existential conventional attack, one that threatened the very survival of the state. However, the new doctrine now states that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if the threat comes in the form of a conventional attack. This also includes situations where Russia's ally Belarus is attacked, or if a non-nuclear power, with support from a nuclear-armed state, engages in acts of war against Russia. Essentially, any attack by a NATO member or a joint attack involving NATO support could be deemed as an attack on Russia itself, thereby triggering the potential use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the timing of this decree is no coincidence. Putin wanted to make it clear that he views Biden's decision as a direct threat to Russia's security. The Kremlin has long warned that if NATO provided Ukraine with weapons capable of reaching Russian territory, it would consider NATO's involvement in the conflict as direct. In response, Russia wouldn't hesitate to escalate the situation. However, these repeated threats have always been just that: threats, empty words. This makes Putin's reaction just another desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control over a situation that has increasingly slipped from his grasp. But unless nuclear weapons truly enter the game, Russia is, as it stands, finished. It's losing troops, equipment, and money at an unprecedented rate. Now, with the capability for long-range strikes in Ukrainian hands, it will also lose territory and infrastructure. In other words, it's truly game over. But what do you think? Is Russia truly done, or will it find a way to turn the tide? Will the West continue to provide the necessary support to Ukraine, or will the recent changes in the US leadership begin to fracture the coalition? The last week of November 2024 was an absolute nightmare for Russia. As if its special military operation couldn't get any worse, it absorbed hit after hit during the week that built up to the point where Russia simply couldn't take it anymore. Its back has been broken. The collapse of the ruble, staggering casualty numbers, the West completely ignoring its nuclear threats, and ongoing protests in Georgia combined to make the period between November 25th and December 1st the worst week Russia has ever had in the Ukraine war. And in this video, we're going to dig into these four major events, explaining why each one has damaged Russian President Vladimir Putin's ambitions. We start with the ruble. Panic reigned in the Kremlin on November 28th as the ruble crumbled to a symbolic low against the US dollar. Russia's currency hit 114 against the dollar before starting a slow and small recovery. The collapse had been coming. The ruble had lost about a third of its value since August 2024, with hitting the 114 mark being the true low point for a currency that's struggling to maintain any semblance of power in the wake of US and European sanctions. "Buckle up your rubles," screamed a report in Russia's Kommersant newspaper amidst claims that what was happening to the ruble read like a war report. And the paper was right. The ruble's collapse is especially damaging to Russia because its currency's decline is a direct result of Putin's actions in Ukraine. Around 2014, the currency was trading at 30 against the dollar. Even toward the end of 2022, it was still hovering around the 60 mark, which suggested that Putin had found workarounds for many of the sanctions placed against his country at the time. The West has been tightening the noose on those workarounds. Russia's November currency crumble came in the wake of a new raft of US sanctions on Russian banks that helped the country process its international transactions. Gazprom Bank was the hardest hit of these financial institutions. Russia's third largest lender is also its preferred intermediary for handling the payments Russia receives for its energy products. It was also one of the only handful of Russian banks that wasn't under any sanctions already because it played a key role in allowing European countries to buy energy from Russia. That role is no longer needed. European gas imports from Russia have been in freefall ever since the start of Putin's special military operation. In 2021, the year before Putin started his war, Russia's share of the EU pipeline gas supply was 40%. By 2023, that share had dropped to just 8%, with European countries increasingly relying on Norway and the US for their gas. With Gazprombank under sanctions, the stage was set for the ruble's collapse, and it gets worse for Russia. Its central bank, or CBR, was forced to halt foreign purchases on the country's domestic currency market until the end of 2024 to try and reduce volatility. That short-term measure isn't going to do much. The issue with the ruble is just a symptom of a Russian economy that's in crisis. Blue Bay asset management strategist Timothy Ash says, "A weaker ruble means higher inflation, higher CBR policy rates as a response, and lower real GDP growth as a result. Russia's people are already struggling under a base interest rate of 21%, and inflation that's expected to be in the 8 to 8.5% range come the end of 2024. Any more pressure and the everyday Russian is going to find themselves mired even deeper into a cost of living crisis. And that extra pressure is coming." CNBC said on December 16th that Russia is bracing itself for a massive interest rate hike, amidst reports that its consumer index rate rose to 8.9% in November. Perhaps the 8.5% maximum for the end of the year is starting to look ambitious. It now seems likely that the CBR will raise Russia's base rate to 23% following a meeting on December 20th. What this means for Putin is that his people can buy less, borrow less, and will be increasingly unhappy with how his war in Ukraine is affecting their daily lives. It also shows him just how reliant Russia's economy is on energy exports and how a lack of diversification, combined with sanctions, threatens to isolate Russia further. Economic autonomy is slipping out of Putin's hands. And if Russia's worst week ever is any indicator, the country will likely have to increasingly rely on China and India to buck up its trade. Both countries, though loosely aligned with Russia via the BRICS economic group, also want to maintain some semblance of strong trading relationships with the West to keep themselves running. Russia can only rely on them so much as its economy starts to crumble. Still, if that was all that went wrong during the last week of November, Russia's leader would be able to absorb the blow. But there's a problem. The war into which he's invested so much Russian money isn't going especially well. Russia is losing more of its soldiers than ever before against the brave Ukrainian defense. That brings us to the second reason the last week of November was so terrible for Russia: record casualty rates. 2 records, in fact. On November 29th, the Kyiv Independent reported that the previous day had seen Russia lose more soldiers to death or injury in a single day than at any other point during the war. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said Russia lost 2,030 soldiers, breaking past the 2,000 barrier for the first time. And crazily enough, this wasn't the first time that Russia had broken its own daily loss rate record for November. On November 12th, it almost breached the 2,000 barrier with 1,950 casualties, another all-time high. Of course, you could argue that these figures are massaged somewhat. They come directly from Ukraine, which has a definite interest in making it look like the war is going as poorly as possible for Russia. However, other Western sources support their claims and are also reporting massive casualty rates. The UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, says that Russia broke a second record in November, most soldiers lost in a single month. It said Putin's military suffered 45,680 casualties in total for November, giving it a daily loss average of 1,523. It also confirmed that Russia lost more than 2,000 soldiers in a single day on November 28th. Putin is a record breaker. Twice, but not in the way that he would want to be. Along with all of those casualties, Russia had to absorb some pretty substantial equipment losses. Ukraine claims to have also destroyed 900 infantry fighting vehicles, approximately the same number of artillery systems, and 300 Russian tanks during November. In fact, the month as a whole marked the third straight month that Russia had broken its own record for troop casualties too. The last week of the month was just the coda that showcases just how brutal Putin's meat grinder tactics are for his soldiers. Now, there are reasons for these higher losses. The MOD says that Russia has increased the tempo of its operations, particularly in the Donetsk region. It's also committed 50,000 soldiers, both Russian and North Korean, to its counteroffensive in Kursk, where it's trying to push out the Ukrainian forces that took around 450 square miles of the oblast back in August. Russia is experiencing some success in both regions. Ukraine has lost about 40% of the land it seized in Kursk, though much of that is territory from which it has withdrawn to fortify its soldiers against the incoming Russian troops. Russia has also managed to capture around 300 square miles of the Donetsk region during its multi-month campaign there. So Putin is making gains. He's just doing it while sacrificing tens of thousands of his soldiers in the process. Still, the last week of November has exposed his tactical ineptitude like no other week. Losing over 2,000 soldiers in a day shouldn't be happening to a country that has a military as powerful as Russia. Yet it is, because Putin's tactical expertise extends to launching rockets at targets and sending soldiers in on foot to absorb Ukrainian ammunition. Russia treats its own soldiers like cannon fodder, and while the approach brings some success, the territory it gains comes at an enormous cost. The Institute for the Study of War says that Russia's autumn offensives alone have cost it 125,800 soldiers, meaning it's losing around 50 troops for every 0.38 square miles it captures. That ratio has declined in the last week of November, with even higher troop losses, with Putin having to face up to the possibility that he may not be able to keep his meat grinder running for much longer. After all, he's already relying on North Korea to supplement his ailing forces. He's also increasingly relying on recruiting mercenaries from low-income countries like Cuba and India, from which he may have recruited up to 15,000 soldiers. He's doing all of this to avoid being forced into a second round of mobilization that would further deplete Russia's struggling population. But if the November 28th losses show us anything, it's that Putin is going to have to grind through tens of thousands more soldiers, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, if he's going to finally take Ukraine. So we have two reasons why the week beginning November 25th was Russia's worst ever. The ruble collapsed, and it broke two of its own records for troop casualty rates. But at least Putin has Russia's nuclear arsenal on which to rely, right? He can still be a threat to the West. Except that isn't working out well for him either. On November 19th, Putin approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine that were first tabled in September. The changes marked the 1,000th day of Russia's special military operation, and likely came as a well-timed response to President Joe Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use ATACMS long-range missiles inside Russia the day before. The message Putin was trying to send was that any nation that supported Ukraine could face nuclear consequences from Russia. Russia's new doctrine is certainly set up to say as much. It now says that any large attack on Russia could meet the criteria for a nuclear response. That large attack doesn't have to come from enemy nukes. It could include any strike that Russia believes affects its sovereignty, including those made using drones, aircraft, missiles, and other conventional means. More worrying for the collective West is the provision for joint attacks. Russia says that any state that is a member of a coalition will be considered just as guilty of provoking an attack that could warrant a nuclear retaliation as the state that actually makes the attack. In other words, if Ukraine threatens Russia's sovereignty, then it wouldn't be only Ukraine in the nuclear firing line. The US, the UK, and all of Ukraine's other Western partners would also face nuclear retaliation. It's far from the first time Putin has rattled Russia's nuclear saber during the Ukraine war, but it's the most intense rattle, and one that Putin hoped would intimidate the West into pulling back on its support for Ukraine. Unfortunately for Russia, the exact opposite has happened. The last week of November revealed that Ukraine's Western allies are intent on calling Putin's bluff over his new nuclear doctrine. ATACMS usage certainly wasn't withdrawn. On November 26th, the BBC reported that Ukraine carried out a strike in the Lotarevka region that took out one of Russia's advanced S-400 aerial defense systems. But there are other signs that the West isn't taking Russia's nuclear threat seriously. The UK, for instance, approved the use of Storm Shadow long-range missiles after Putin signed his new nuclear doctrine into law. They also slammed Putin for the nuclear doctrine change, saying, "There is irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia, and that's not going to deter our support for Ukraine." In other words, Putin can rattle his saber as much as he likes, because it's not going to change anything. That response has been accompanied by a collective shrug of Western shoulders at Putin's nuclear threats in the last week of November. The Conversation claims that Russia has neither the capability nor the appetite for direct military confrontation with NATO. Going nuclear against any of Ukraine's NATO allies would mean a direct response from three other nuclear nations, the US, UK, and France. Putin wants no part of that response, and the West knows it. Russia's bluff was called in the last week of November. Long-range missiles are still being used in Russian territory. Support is still flowing into Ukraine. None of the Western nations that Putin is attempting to threaten are taking Russia's leader seriously. That's not to say that Russia doesn't pose a severe nuclear threat. Russia has 1,549 strategic warheads in place, according to the Arms Control Association. It also has 4,380 nukes beyond that in its stockpiles and another 1,200 that are in the process of being decommissioned. Putin's problem is that the US has about the same amounts in all areas, with the UK and France combining to add 515 nuclear weapons to the Western stockpile. Putin's attempts to create a climate of fear around nuclear weapons aren't working, because the West knows he won't risk its response. After all, Putin started his special military operation because he wanted to make Ukraine part of the Russian Federation. Obliterating it with nuclear weapons before turning those weapons on the West would run counter to his goals. So the final week of November saw Putin's nuclear threats fall on deaf ears as he lost record numbers of soldiers and watched as the ruble crumbled. Russia's leader was already standing on very shaky ground when another incident during the week weakened Russia's position further. Protests in Georgia. What does Georgia have to do with Russia? It all comes down to Georgia's Kremlin-friendly government. In the run-up to Georgia's October 2024 elections, Russia threw its support behind the Georgian Dream Party. That party won Georgia's elections with 54% of the vote, though the results were disputed by many, including Georgia's current president, Saloma Zurabishvili. She branded the results of the election as illegitimate, claiming the entire fiasco was a Russian special operation. Regardless, the Kremlin managed to sneak its tendrils into the Georgian government, and the country's people aren't happy about it. On November 29th, thousands of people took to the streets of Georgia's capital city Tbilisi to protest against the government suspending talks with the European Union or EU about the country's accession into the group's ranks. Zurabishvili wasn't among the protesters, though she offered her support, claiming, "The resistance movement has begun." In an address on Georgian television, she also said, "We will remain united until Georgia achieves its goals, to return to its European path and secure new elections." Unfortunately for Zurabishvili, her position in Georgia is largely ceremonial. The country's true power lies with its prime minister, Irakli Kobakidze, a man widely believed to be in the Kremlin's pocket. Kobakidze has claimed that he isn't influenced by Russia, of course, but the acclaim he delivered to Georgia's police for defending the country's constitutional order would suggest otherwise. That's especially the case given that Georgia's human rights ombudsman said the arrested protesters faced brutality that had no justification, as they reported on police exceeding their authority. There is anger at Russia inside Georgia. The BBC reports that the protesters threw stones, glass bottles, and lit fireworks during the protests, all signals that they were very unhappy over what they see as Russia's attempts to influence Georgia's efforts to get into the EU. An open letter signed by more than 100 of Georgia's top civil servants and diplomats also said that Georgia's decision to delay talks didn't align with the country's strategic interests. For his part, Kobakidze has accused the EU of trying to blackmail Georgia, especially in regards to its noting of significant irregularities in Georgia's October elections. That sounds an awful lot like Putin talking out of Kobakidze's mouth, especially given that 80% of Georgians support EU integration. And therein lies the problem for Putin. He likely hoped that his interference in Georgian politics would allow him to essentially turn the former Soviet republic into a Russian satellite state. Now he's managed to influence the country's Kremlin-friendly government to put the entire EU issue on the back burner until the end of 2028, likely because he hopes his special military operation in Ukraine will have ended well before then. That would allow him to focus on enhancing his influence further in Georgia, eventually leading to the cancellation of these talks altogether. The Georgian people know exactly what he's trying to do. Chants of "Russian slaves" were levied at police officers guarding the country's parliament building, demonstrating precisely what they think about what's going on in Georgia. Make no mistake, Georgia's protests are bad news for Russia. The thousands taking to the streets in Tbilisi are telling Putin in no uncertain terms that his influence isn't welcome in their country. To the rest of the world, particularly the West, this open defiance of the Kremlin is another indicator that Russia is losing its influence among its former Soviet states. Putin had hoped to influence Georgia's elections to essentially place Russia in control of Georgia. He succeeded in terms of getting his prime minister into office, but his actions have sparked a spirit of rebellion in Georgia, a country in which Russia's military occupies 20% of the country. That rebellion could grow violent at a time when Russia can ill afford to spare even more troops, given the extent of its losses in Ukraine. Georgia's protests were the cherry on the top of the terrible Sunday of Russia's worst week since the war began. It's losing more people than ever, the ruble is in the doldrums, and with the Georgia protests and the West's collective shrugging of its shoulders at Putin's military threats, Russia is also facing up to the fact that its influence doesn't extend anywhere near as much as it believed. And to cap it all off for Putin, all of this is happening at a time when President-elect Donald Trump is preparing to enter office in January. Trump is likely to push for an immediate end to the war in Ukraine when he enters office, with most believing that he's going to try to get Ukraine and Russia to sign a peace plan. Russia will naturally want to be in as powerful a position as possible for the negotiations related to that plan. That's why it's trying so hard now to retake Kursk, capture more of the Donetsk region, and throw around nuclear threats. But this four-punch combo of issues that hit Russia between November 25th and December 1st has broken its back, at least from a negotiating sense. Russia is clearly weakening. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will point to all of these problems during any peace negotiation, using them as leverage to get what he wants out of any deal that Trump oversees. Russia is more vulnerable now than at any point during the Ukraine war, thanks to its week from hell. Do you think it can recover in time for Trump's peace talks?